Chapter 152. Yi Jingwen kept his word. From that day onwards, he and Mo Tiange went to the martial arts hall every day to compare notes on fights of magical powers. He was a sword cultivator, so he was infatuated with comparing skills and was quite knowledgeable about fights of magical powers. Because of that, Mo Tiange's skills in fights of magical powers improved very quickly after sparring with him. More than a month later, relying on the advantage of magic weapons, Mo Tiange was able to win 2 out of 3 matches. Yi Jingwen was greatly stimulated, so he decided to go back and enter closed-door meditation. Thus the 10-year period ended. Lord Taoist Jinghe told Mo Tiange that she had been in closed-door meditation for a long time, and her cultivation level was high enough, so she could leave the mountain and travel around. After Mo Tiange finished taking care of her chores, she sealed her immortal's cave, and soon left Mount Taikong with Yi Jinji. There were more than 10 countries in the celestial pole. Wei country was located in the Midland, with Jin and Yin in the east, and Qin and Chu in the west. It was surrounded by powerful enemies. For this reason, the state of Wei provided for several immortal masters, and even conferred the title of Marquis to several secluded cultivation clans in order to ensure peace. Several days after they left West Kunwu, Mo Tiange and Yi Jinji arrived at Tong, an city in Wei country. Tong, an city was not only the largest city in Wei country, but it was also the transportation hub of the entire celestial pole. It was located at the junction of the north and south, built by the river, connected to both land and water. In the west it was connected to the Qin Mountains and the Chu lands, and in the east, it reached the Jin and Yin plains. As a result, Tong'an City was one of the most prosperous cities in the entire celestial pole. The awkward thing was that Yi Jinji was too young when he left home, so he didn't remember where the Yi clan was. Fortunately, the Yi family had the identity of the Marquis of Chongmingho in Wei country. They asked along the way and quickly found the Yi residence. In Tong'an City, the east was rich and the west noble, while the south was poor and the north lowly. The Yi family was a noble, and lived in the west of the city. The two of them found their way to the west of the city. Vermilion doors and stone lions could be found everywhere. The Yi family was also very conspicuous among these noble families. On the signboard at the door, the words Chongmingho Manor were written. Upon seeing this, Yi Jinji was very happy. He immediately wanted to go in, but who would have thought that the gatekeeper would stop him and say with an arrogant expression, "This is Marquis Ningho's estate. Unauthorized people are not allowed to enter." Yi Jinji was stunned. Behind him, Mo Tiange couldn't help but want to laugh. In the secular world, most people judged a person by his appearance. Although Yi Jinji looked like a distinguished young man, his clothes were simple and unadorned, and his bearing didn't have the noble air of a young master. These gatekeeping manservants naturally thought he was a commoner, so they never expected he was actually their young master. After being stunned for a moment, Yi Jinji shouted, "What idler? This is my home. I'm from the Yi family." One of the manservants glanced at him and said in an arrogant tone, "Go, go, go. Don't cause trouble if you have nothing to do." Yi Jinji became anxious and said angrily, "My surname is Yi, and my name is Jinji. You guys go and report this to the Marquis." After he reported his name, the manservants looked at him seriously. "His surname is Yi, could it really be? Even if his surname is Yi, we can't say that he's from our family. But what if it is?" The manservants muttered for a while. Finally, one of them said, "Wait here, I'll go in and report." Although he agreed, he didn't show any respect. Yi Jinji restrained his temper and looked at Mo Tiange. Seeing that her expression was calm, he reluctantly nodded. After the manservant went in, he walked to Mo Tiange and said apologetically, "Martial uncle, the servants at home don't look good. I'll have to trouble you to wait for a while." Mo Tiange didn't say anything and just smiled. She found it interesting. In fact, people in the cultivation world were also like this. However, they didn't look at other people's clothes, but at their cultivation level. Before long, they heard the sound of hurried footsteps. The two of them looked up and saw an old man wearing an embroidered robe leading the way, followed by a group of people who were rushing to the gate. The manservant who reported the news just now followed behind them, nervously wiping the sweat on his face. Upon seeing this old man, Emotienga guessed his identity. Sure enough, as soon as Yi Jinji saw this person, an excited and hesitant expression appeared on his face. He left home when he was 9 years old, and it had been more than 11 years since then. The child from back then had already become a young man, but when he saw his elders he felt shy. Jinner, a noble woman, rushed out of the crowd. She staggered forward regardless of the pearls and jades on her body. As soon as Yi Jinji saw her, he was stunned. The woman threw herself at him, hugged his head and cried bitterly. Jinner, my Jinner, you're finally back. Yi Jinji's lips trembled. After a long time he finally called out, Mother. He also shed silent tears. Emotienga stood behind them, watching the family reunite after a long separation, and greeting each other with tears. She sighed inwardly. This was also her family. It was just that she didn't have any kinship with them, so she kept herself out of it. After a long time, Yi Jinji finally met all his relatives. Remembering that she was still on the side, he hastily wiped the tears on his face and came to her. Martial uncle, this is my family. Upon hearing him calling her martial uncle, everyone in Yi clan hurriedly changed their expressions and looked at her. Emotienga had already swept them with her divine sense. There were several cultivators among the people of Yi clan, but their spiritual roots were quite weak. The one with the highest cultivation level was only in the 3rd layer of the aura refining realm. He was the old man who took the lead. When these cultivators sensed her hidden cultivation level, they all had respectful expressions on their faces. They asked Yi Jinji just now and knew his cultivation level was in the 10th layer of the aura refining realm. Since he called her martial uncle, they knew Emotienga must be a cultivator in the foundation building realm or higher. Although she looked like she was only 18 or 19 years old, they didn't dare to neglect her. Martial uncle, let me introduce you. This is my grandpa, Yi Jinji said as he led Emotienga to the old man who took the lead. This old man had gray hair, but he was in good spirits. After all, he was a 3rd layer aura refining cultivator, and had lived in the secular world for many years, so he was very experienced. He cupped his hands respectfully. This old man is Yi Cheng, the head of Yi clan. Greetings to senior. So this was the Yi Cheng's second uncle mentioned. In terms of seniority, he was several generations lower than her. Emotienga calmly accepted his greeting and nodded in return. Yi Jinji continued to lead her to the next middle-aged man. This is my father. Junior Yi Zhuan greets senior. This person was also a cultivator, but his cultivation level was only in the 1st layer of the aura refining realm. Yi Jinji then pointed at the woman who hugged him and cried bitterly a moment ago and said, This is my mother. The noble woman bowed with a grateful expression. I can't thank senior enough for taking care of my family's Jinner. Emotienga finally raised her hand. Madam, you don't need to be so polite. Since I'm his master's elder, I naturally have to take care of him. Soon after, several other people saluted her one by one. After a long time, the greetings were finally over. Yi Cheng cautiously invited Emotienga to sit in the hall and dismissed the unnecessary people, leaving only a few important people to sit with her. Once they were seated, Yi Cheng said to Yi Jinji, Zhen, why don't you introduce this martial uncle of yours? When Yi Jinji met his relatives before, he only said that Emotienga was his martial uncle, and that she took good care of him. This time, he wanted to go down the mountain, so she especially brought him here. Upon hearing what Yi Jinji said, Yi Jinji hastily stood up. Grandpa Patriarch, this martial uncle is my Grandmaster Jinghe's last disciple. My master has always been in closed-door meditation, so it's always martial uncle Mo who's been teaching me. She's really my teacher. Oh. Upon hearing what he said, everyone in the hall looked at Emotienga in a different light. In other words, although she was a martial uncle, she was no different from a master. Moreover, she was the last disciple of a nascent soul grandmaster at Xianqing School. From this, it could be seen how talented she was, and how honorable her status was. Weak cultivators like them who couldn't stay in Kunwood definitely couldn't imagine her. Yi Cheng once again stood up. Turns out senior has such a great kindness toward my Zhener. This old man thanks Senior here. No need to be like this, Emotinga said with a smile. Junji is a sensible and well-mannered child. Although he's lacking in talent, he's diligent and studious. Sooner or later, he'll become a great person. Yiqing was very excited to hear Emotinga's evaluation. If he can become a great person, it's his good fortune and also thanks to Senior. After the two of them chatted like that, Yiqing asked again, Senior, do you have something to do in the secular world? Although this old man's cultivation level is low, I have some status in the secular world. Maybe I can help Senior inquire about some information. I didn't come to the secular world for anything important. I just came out to travel. I see. Senior, you rarely come to the secular world, right? Our Yi clan has lived in the secular world for a long time, so we know a lot of strange things in the secular world. If Senior doesn't mind, this old man can introduce a thing or two to Senior. Yiqing was very enthusiastic. Emotinga thought for a moment, then nodded with a smile. Then I'll have to trouble you. It's no trouble, no trouble. Yiqing said. Senior must be tired since you came all the way from Kunwu. How about staying at my place for the time being? Later on, this old man will deliver all the information my family has gathered to you. Emotinga originally didn't have the patience to deal with people like this, so she immediately agreed and left first. After watching Emotinga leave, Yiqing suddenly asked, Zhener, what's the identity of this martial uncle of yours? Yi Zhenji was startled and somewhat frightened. Grandpa Patriarch, she's my martial uncle. She's a foundation building cultivator. Yes, martial uncle has been in closed-door meditation for 5 years, and has just reached the peak of the middle stage of the foundation building realm. Now Grandmaster ordered her to leave the mountain to travel. She's training her mental state, so that she can break through to the late stage of the foundation building realm. I see. Yiqing frowned slightly. How old is this Senior? How's her aptitude? She's only in the foundation building realm, but your nascent soul Grandmaster actually accepted her as a disciple? Yi Zhenji saw that Yiqing didn't look suspicious, so he calmed down and answered, Martial uncle, she should be 37 years old. I'm not very clear about her spiritual roots, but I know it's a very special kind of spiritual roots that aren't inferior to single spiritual roots. 37 years old. Yiqing was astonished. 37 years old. And her cultivation level was in the peak of the middle stage of the foundation building realm. No wonder she could be accepted as a disciple by a nascent soul cultivator. She must be a genius. Zhener, how's your relationship with your martial uncle? Yi Zhenji thought for a moment then answered. Ever since I entered my master's tutelage, martial uncle taught me personally, so it's not wrong to say martial uncle is my master. Then does your martial uncle have other disciples? No. Martial uncle is still young, so he only taught me on behalf of my master. He doesn't have any disciples. Upon hearing this, Yiqing pondered for a moment while stroking his beard. All of a sudden he cautiously said, Zhener, from now on, you have to get closer to your martial uncle. With her current age and cultivation level, as well as the last disciple of a nascent soul grandmaster, she'll certainly have a bright future. You'll definitely benefit from being on good terms with her. Yi Zhenji knew Grandpa Patriarch's words were for his sake, but it really made him unhappy. He was close to his aunt from the start, so it wasn't because of any benefits. Grandpa Patriarch, martial uncle sincerely treats me well, and I also sincerely respect her. Rest assured, my relationship with martial uncle has always been very good. Chapter 153. Knock knock. 2 soft pecking sounds came from outside the door. Emotinga stopped cultivating. She swept the door with her divine sense, and removed the restriction outside. Please come in. The one who pushed the door open was Yi Zhenji's mother, Madame Yen. Madame Yen brought 4 maids with her. She smiled before saying anything. Senior, did I disturb you? Emotinga had a good impression of this Madame Yen, probably because her maternal love for Yi Zhenji reminded her of her own mother. Nothing. Is something the matter, madam? Oh, it's like this. The guest room is simple and crude, and I'm afraid Senior won't be used to it. As she spoke, she signaled the maids to put down the things in their hands. Emotienga glanced at them. They were all flashy but impractical things used by rich people. So she shook her head. Madam, you don't have to be so polite. It's not good for cultivators like us to pay too much attention to external objects. These things are useless to me, so Madam doesn't need to worry about them. This senior is an honored guest of my Yi clan. I'm afraid I'm not good enough. Emotienga smiled faintly. I understand Madam's intention, but these external objects are really unnecessary. Seeing how determined she was, Madame Yin had no choice but to order all the maids to leave. However, after hesitating for a moment, Madame Yin still smiled and said, I have something to tell Senior. I don't know if it's convenient for Senior. Madam, if you have something to say, just say it. With her permission, Madame Yin ordered the maids to leave first and stayed alone. Senior, I shouldn't disturb your cultivation for such a trivial matter. But I'm a mother, so I always want to know more about my son. Madame Yin paused nervously for a moment before continuing. You're Zhener's martial uncle, and you've spent a lot of time with Zhener in the past 10 years. However, I haven't been able to see him for such a long time. Senior, are you willing to tell me about Zhener? How has he been all these years? Has he suffered any grievances? How is he now? Emotienga had no reason to refuse such a small request. A mother whose child had been away from her for 11 years was naturally eager to know more about her child. Madam, you don't need to worry. Jinji is doing very well. He's an advanced inner disciple of a core formation cultivator, so he'll be fine. Really? Does he have friends in the sect? Were you bullied? Emotienga chuckled. His grandmaster is Lord Taoist Jinghe. Who would dare to bully him? Moreover, if you want to bully him, I won't ignore it. Don't worry, madam. This child has a gentle personality and is very popular. That's good. Madame Yin was gratified. Zhener has been sensible since he was a child. If there is anything wrong, he definitely won't tell us. I was worried about this, so I came to disturb Senior. Senior, Zhener has already reached the 10th layer of qi refining. Why did he choose to leave the sect at this time? Upon seeing Madame Yan's worried expression, Emotienga explained. I originally wanted to wait until he built his foundation before letting him come back on his own. But Jinji really missed you guys, so he begged you for a long time. Coincidentally, I was ordered by my master to leave the mountain, so I sent him here directly. So that's how it is. Madame Yan's gaze swept over Emotienga, then she suddenly asked, Senior, you look so young. May I know how old you are? This question was indeed a bit abrupt, so Emotienga was startled. Her age wasn't something she couldn't say, so she answered, I'm 37 years old now. Oh, Senior's age is similar to mine, but you look like a 17 or 18-year-old girl. You really make mortals like me envious. In fact, Madame Yan's appearance was already quite young. Yi Jinji happened to be 20 years old, and Madame Yin was his birth mother, so she must be at least 35 years old. However, she took good care of herself, so there weren't any wrinkles on her face. She looked like she was in her 30s, which was the age when women were most mature and charming. Emotienga didn't flatter her back. Instead, her sharp gaze swept over Madame Yan's face, and she asked faintly, Madam, what do you mean? If she couldn't hear the hidden meaning behind Madame Yan's words, she'd be too slow. Sure enough, this Madame Yan's intention wasn't that simple. Being stared at like this, Madame Yin was a bit embarrassed. She stammered. It's nothing. Senior's age is similar to mine, but you look about the same age as Zhener, so I really can't tell. You're his elder. Presumably, if I said your brother and sister, other people would also believe it. Emotienga suddenly felt like she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. This Madame Yin was obviously worried that there was some unexplainable relationship between her and Yi Jinji. Nevertheless, Emotienga's expression didn't change. She just stared straight at Madame Yin. Madame Yin was only a mortal. Under Emotienga's inadvertent spiritual aura pressure, she had no ability to resist at all, causing her to break out in a cold sweat. She hastily grabbed a handkerchief to wipe her sweat, but she couldn't even lift her hand. With great difficulty she said, Senior, if I offended you in any way, please forgive me. Madame Yin recklessly speculated about her relationship with Yi Jinji. Although she was Yi Jinji's mother, it still made Madame Yin feel displeased, so she deliberately acted like this. Now that Madame Yin saw that Madame Yin was showing weakness, she withdrew her spiritual aura pressure and said coldly, "For cultivators like us, looks are merely the bones beneath the skin. Madam, you shouldn't say such things in the future." Madame Yin naturally didn't dare to refute her. She recalled the clan head's instruction to treat this senior well. Her behavior just now might have already offended the other party, so she repeatedly apologized. "Senior, please forgive me for offending you. I'm just an ignorant woman who didn't know about cultivators' taboos and spoke nonsense." Emotinga interrupted her. "Madam, you're Jinji's mother, so there are some things you have the right to ask clearly. If you don't ask clearly, presumably you also won't feel at ease, right? That being the case, if there's anything you want to say, just say it." Madame Yin finally calmed down a bit when she heard no anger in Emotinga's tone. Upon seeing Emotinga's calm demeanor, Madame Yin couldn't help but feel ashamed. "Senior, please forgive me. I really saw that you and Jinji have a close relationship, so I was afraid that child would make a mistake. You're his martial uncle. If that child doesn't understand things, wouldn't he implicate you and ruin your clean reputation?" She spoke politely, but this Madame Yin wasn't someone who didn't understand things. Emotinga softened her tone. "Madam, Yi clan has been in the secular world for more than 20 years, right? Have you ever been to Kunwu?" Madame Yin was startled, but she soon nodded. When she married into Yi clan was already Marquis Chaininghao in Wei country, so she naturally hadn't been to Kunwu. "It's no wonder you don't know about the cultivation world. In the cultivation world, there's no such thing as human relationships in the secular world. Everything is determined by cultivation levels. Regarding dual cultivation, seniority and age have nothing to do with other people. No matter who Jinji likes, it won't affect his future." Upon seeing Madame Yan's complexion turn pale, Emotinga smiled and continued. "Besides, how can one's age be accurately determined based on one's appearance? That master of mine is more than 800 years old, but he looks like he's only in his 30s. Jinji's master also looks similar to Jinji's age. Madam, Jinji respects me as his master, so how could there be anything embarrassing? Madam, please don't think too much. Otherwise, if Jinji finds out, he'll inevitably be sad and embarrassed." Madame Yan's face turned green then white, but she couldn't say anything. She was just a mortal woman. How could she know anything about the cultivation world? As a mother, she was just worried about her child. Emotinga's straightforwardness made her feel too ashamed to show her face. "All right, I'm going to continue cultivating. Madam, it's rare for Jinji to come home, so you'd better spend more time with him." Emotinga straightforwardly sent the guest off, then sat cross-legged and closed her eyes, looking as if she didn't want to say anything. Madame Yin bowed embarrassedly then retreated. Emotinga didn't care too much about this matter. This Madame Yin was a mortal woman, so it was understandable that she didn't understand. Mortals always thought that when men and women were the same age, even if they had different seniority, something was bound to happen. However, they didn't know that in the cultivation world, judging people by their age was the most ridiculous thing. Emotinga cultivated until the evening. Yi Cheng, the patriarch of Yi clan, sent someone to invite her, saying she came from afar, and that they were holding a banquet to thank her master in Jinji's stead. Emotinga thought about it, but still went to the banquet. Before his death, second uncle entrusted her to take care of Yi clan when she had the ability. Now that she came to Yi clan, doing something within her ability was also something she ought to do. "Senior, you're finally here. Please sit, please sit." As soon as Emotinga arrived at the banquet hall, Yi Cheng enthusiastically welcomed her. A banquet table was already set up in the hall. Golden cups and silver cups could be seen, and the place was resplendent. "Martial uncle." Yi Jinji also came over. Emotinga smiled at him. This was a private banquet, so there weren't many people present. Aside from Yi Cheng, Yi Jinji, and Yi Jinji's father, Yi Zhuan, there were 4 other people. All of them were cultivators, but their cultivation levels were only in the first or second layer. 2 of them were middle-aged, one was a young man, and one was a teenager. Yi Qing introduced them one by one. Senior, these are my Yi clan's good-for-nothing juniors. Yi Mao, Yi Yu, Yi Bing, and Yi Dun. Yi Mao and Yi Yu were the two middle-aged men. Judging from their seniority, they should be in the same generation as Yi Cheng. Yi Bing was the young man. His name was in the same generation as Yi Juan. But Yi Dun didn't know his seniority. However, according to Yi clan's naming convention, Yi Zhenji was an exception. Mo Tinga didn't know whether it was because he was placed high hopes on him since he was a child. Junior greets senior. All the cultivators of Yi clan were extremely respectful. Mo Tinga was impatient with these things, so she said, "We're all cultivators, so we can dispense with these common customs." Yi Qing noticed she wasn't happy, so he hastily stopped her and said with a smile, "In that case, we'll do as senior said. You can all take your seats." Everyone from Yi clan took their respective seats. Yi Cheng gave the order to start the banquet, and a maid immediately came forward to open the lids of the bowls. Delicacies from the land and the sea were all extremely luxurious. Yi Cheng said humbly, "This old man knows senior has already transcended the mortal world. It's just that we've been in the secular world for a long time, so we can't bring out anything good. Although these foods are from the secular world, they can still be considered delicious." Mo Tinga smiled faintly. "Patriarchy, you don't have to be so polite." "Yes, Grandpa Patriarch," Yi Zhenji said. "Martial Uncle won't blame us." Seeing this, Yi Qing couldn't help but criticize him. "Child, no one will blame you for being too polite." Yi Zhenji wasn't convinced. Just as he was about to say something, Mo Tinga stopped him and said with a smile, "Your Grandpa Patriarch is right. If you want to interact with others, you'd better behave like this. But there's no need for that today. Patriarchy, I watched Zhenji grow up, so I don't treat you as outsiders. You can dispense with these empty formalities." Upon hearing the words, "I don't treat you as outsiders," Yi Qing instantly felt comfortable. He smiled and nodded repeatedly. "Yes, yes. Since senior said so, we'll do as you say." Soon after, everyone persuaded Mo Tinga to drink some wine, and began to chat with her. Yi clan had left Kunwu for several decades. Now that they suddenly met a foundation-building senior, they naturally had a lot of things to ask about cultivation. The teenager called Yi Dun in particular still had the temperament of a child, so he wasn't as reserved as the adults. If he had any questions, he just opened his mouth and asked. He was reprimanded by his elders, but after seeing Mo Tinga kindly answering all of their questions, the elders finally let him go. Gradually, under the control of Yi Dun and Yi Zhenji, the adults also relaxed. This way, the guests and the hosts were both happy. By the way, senior, when they were almost done talking about cultivation, Yi Qing suddenly said, "There's one thing Junior doesn't quite understand, so I'd like to ask Senior." "Please ask." Yi Qing looked quite hesitant, but in the end he asked, "I saw that the spirit tool Senior gave Zhen, didn't seem to be an ordinary one. May I know where Senior obtained it?" Mo Tinga was stunned, but she immediately understood what he wanted to ask. The spirit tool in Yi Zhenji's hand was the greenwood sword, right? This sword came from Yi clan, so this patriarch of Yi clan had probably seen it before. She glanced at Yi Zhenji, but Yi Zhenji lightly shook his head, indicating that he didn't say anything. Mo Tinga smiled and said, "This thing came from a good friend of mine. It's a family heirloom." "Oh." Yi Qing looked surprised. He asked eagerly, "May I ask Senior, what's your friend's name and where is she now?" Mo Tinga was slightly surprised. "Her surname is Yi, and her name is Xiaotian." "What? Does Patriarchy know her?" Yi Qing was stunned again. "Her surname is Yi, but why is her name Xiaotian? There's no such person in the clan." "Then what about your friend's age and cultivation level?" "She's about the same age as me, but she's already in the foundation building realm." The more Yi Qing asked, the more baffled he became. This doesn't match at all. He wouldn't be surprised if she said she bought this greenwood sword from somewhere, but she said it was Yi Xiaotian's family heirloom, and she was even a young foundation building cultivator. Mo Tinga seemed to suddenly remember something. "Right. My friend was originally from a cultivation clan. Later, her clan declined, and she moved to the secular world. Could it be Yi Cheng's eyes brightened. That sounds like our clan, but I'm not familiar with this name. Mo Tiange thought for a moment then said, she originally had an uncle named Yi Jiang. Do you know him, Patriarch Yi? Upon hearing this name, everyone in Yi clan became excited. They looked at each other and saw surprise and doubt in each other's eyes. In the end, Yi Cheng asked, Senior Yi Jiang? Are you sure that's his name? Of course. Mo Tiange's heart was clear, but she pretended to be calm. I remember she said Yi clan used to be a cultivation clan in Mount Qingmeng. Her father was the most talented cultivator in Yi clan. Back then, his name shook Western Kunwu. He successfully formed his gold core when he was only 100 years old. Patriarch Yi, is this true? Yi clan's most talented cultivator successfully formed his gold core when he was 100 years old. Yi Cheng muttered with a fanatical look in his eyes. Of course he remembered. When he was born, it was the Yi family's golden age. That genius cultivator brought honor to the Yi family that they had never had before. But later, Yi Zhuan took over the conversation. He was the most outstanding cultivator in Yi clan. His name was Hai. Correct. Mo Tiange smiled. That being the case, the clan my friend was talking about was your Yi clan. This is really fate. Unfortunately, I haven't seen my friend for a long time. I don't know where she is now, so I can't tell her. After all, Yi Cheng was the patriarch. After his excitement, he was now full of doubts. But our granduncle didn't leave any descendants. I'm not sure about that. Mo Tiange simply pushed the matter aside. She wanted to play the role of an outsider, so she naturally couldn't say too much about some things. Everyone in Yi clan looked at each other and gradually calmed down. That's right. That granduncle didn't leave any descendants. So how could there be a cultivator from Yi clan? In the end, Yi Cheng said, Senior, do you know how your friend's uncle is now? Can you get in touch with him? Upon hearing this question, Mo Tiange's eyes flashed with a hint of hidden sorrow. She said faintly, her uncle has already passed away. What? Everyone in Yi clan was startled. Yi Zhuan cried out involuntarily. How could that be? That granduncle is only a little over 300 years old, right? According to the lifespan of a foundation-building cultivator, he should still be alive. Correct. It's more appropriate to say that her uncle died because of his death. Mo Tiange's gaze fell on the void with an indifferent expression. The two of them were being chased by other cultivators. In order to protect her, her uncle was seriously injured, so his lifespan was sharply reduced. That's why he passed away. After she finished speaking, the hall became silent. Yi Cheng's expression was gloomy. This kind of thing happened too often in the cultivation world. Individual cultivators without any backing were very likely to encounter this kind of thing. In other words, the last real cultivator in Yi clan was also gone. Then didn't Yi clan really become a mediocre clan in the secular world? Even when they were forced to move out of Mount Qingmeng, Yi Cheng didn't have this kind of desolate feeling back then. He always felt that Yi clan was different from those so-called cultivation clans in the secular world, because they still had a foundation-building elder, who was still alive. But it was only now that he knew that foundation-building elder had already passed away. After thinking for a long time, Yi Cheng finally closed his eyes and sighed. He was already more than 70 years old. Although as a cultivator, it wouldn't be a problem for him to live to more than 100 years old. He was, after all, old. He originally thought that if Zhen was successful and got in touch with that granduncle, Yi clan would still have a chance to return to Kunwu. But now, even if Zhen could build his foundation, how could Yi clan return to Kunwu without an experienced cultivator? Besides, it was still unknown whether Zhen could build his foundation or not. Could it be that Yi clan would really decline in his hands? Senior, is this true? Of course it's true. Mo Tiange's expression was indifferent. Yi Zhenji was the only one who noticed the sadness under her expressionless face. He gently touched her, then called out in a low voice, Martial uncle? Mo Tiange shifted her gaze and smiled at him. There was a meaning in her smile that Yi Zhenji couldn't understand. Yi Cheng muttered, So our Yi clan can't return to Mount Qingmeng. He suddenly cheered up. Senior, that friend of yours, has he really built his foundation now? Can you contact him? I can't. Mo Tiange flatly refused. Patriarchy. My friend promised uncle that when he forms his gold core, she'll give Yi clan a certain amount of help. However, it's best if Yi clan doesn't return to Kunwu. You have to know that enjoying glory and splendor in the secular world is much happier than being weak and living in Kunwu in constant danger. Chapter 154. As the wind blew, a small brown spiritual beast whimpered and rushed to bite Emotinga's sleeve. Emotinga patted its head softly. Don't make trouble. Be quiet for a while. The inferno beast blinked its black eyes, then lowered its head and sat motionlessly next to her. Amused by its aggrieved expression, Emotinga couldn't help but pat it again. What's wrong? Do you think Junji spoils you more when you're with him? The inferno beast whimpered, but it was unclear whether it agreed or disagreed. Emotinga once again stroked its head. She stared at the flowing stream and heaved a sigh. I'm not a good master. I only let you cultivate on your own and help me concoct medicinal pills, but I never played with you. The inferno beast whimpered, bit the hem of her sleeve, and swayed it as if it was acting spoiled. Emotinga smiled and said softly, Xiaohua, stay with Junji, okay? Upon hearing that, the inferno beast raised its head and stared at her face, seemingly not understanding why she said that. There's no spiritual beast contract between us. The reason why you're so close to me is because the virtual sky world and my divine breath are connected. You've lived here for a long time, so you naturally sense me. You watched Junji grow up. All these years when you weren't in the virtual sky world, you were always by his side, so your feelings for him are deeper than mine. Right now, I don't feel at ease leaving him alone in the secular world. Can you stay with him? The inferno beast's eyes widened, but it didn't make a sound. Emotinga knew this inferno beast ate something in the virtual sky world that made it more intelligent than ordinary spiritual beasts. So she didn't order it. She wanted to discuss with it. Don't worry. I concocted a lot of medicinal pills for second and third rank spiritual beasts. I'll give them to Junji, and you won't have any problems cultivating. I'll be gone for at least 3 years, or at most 5 years, so I'll be back before you advance. This was what she thought about for a long time. Without the inferno beast, it would only be inconvenient for her to concoct medicinal pills. However, Junji hadn't built his foundation yet, so she didn't feel at ease leaving him alone in the secular world. It was better to keep Xiaohu by his side. With a second-rank spiritual beast, even if he encountered danger, he would be fine. The inferno beast lowered its head and whimpered a few times. It was a little depressed, but it did not object. Emotinga chuckled. She took out several medicinal pills and fed them to it. She then heaved a sigh and said, I'd better leave first. Yi clan, I can only help them this much. Unless one day, a large number of descendants with spiritual roots appear and are able to support a clan, or if I form my nascent soul, I can protect them. At present, I don't have enough strength. Telling them my identity will only cause more trouble. I hope Shima understands what I'm thinking. Auntie, Yi Junji's voice came from outside. Emotinga raised her hand. With a flash of light between her eyebrows, she arrived in reality. Once the restriction was opened, Yi Junji stepped inside. When he saw her, he smiled and said, Auntie, it wasn't easy for us to leave the mountain, but you're cultivating again. Emotinga smiled and shook her head. I'm used to it. In the past, his aptitude was too poor, so he could only make up for it with hard work. Now that his aptitude was good, he was more worried that he would be too lazy to cultivate and waste his good aptitude. When Yi Junji came in and opened the restriction again, she asked again, What's wrong? Aren't you accompanying your family? It'll be hard to see them in the future. Upon hearing this question, Yi Junji sat down on the table gloomily. Don't mention it. I was talking with my father and the others, but I couldn't get used to it, so I came out. Couldn't get used to it? Emotinga was puzzled. She raised her chin and said, Sit properly on the chair. Yes. Yi Junji obediently got down from the table, pulled a chair and sat in front of her. He said with a puzzled tone, I'm baffled. I remember when I was a child, my father was also very diligent in cultivating. Why is he like this now? Like what? Yi Junji paused for a moment then said with some annoyance, My father always talks to my uncles about eating, drinking, having fun, and playing politics. I don't want to listen, so I said I was looking for Auntie. Seeing Yi Jinji's unhappy expression, Emo Tiange smiled and said softly, Jinji, how old is your father this year? How's his cultivation level? Yi Jinji was stunned. My father is already 45 years old, but he's still in the first layer of the aura refining realm. Seeing that he seemed to have understood something, Emo Tiange said with a smile, although your aptitude isn't outstanding at Xianxing School, you still have hope in cultivating. For individual cultivators in the secular world, without good spirit veins and medicinal pills, it's hard for them to advance in the aura refining realm, even after dozens of years of hard cultivation, let alone building their foundation. It's not that your father and the others don't want to advance, but they don't feel hope. But Yi Jinji wanted to say something, but he felt he couldn't refute her. Emo Tiange said, Jinji, do you still have many medicinal pills for aura refining cultivators? Yi Jinji nodded. I originally wanted to give them all these medicinal pills, but after seeing them like this, I don't want to. It's precisely because they're like this that you have to give them. Why? Yi Jinji didn't understand. Emo Tiange said, your father hasn't been able to make a realm breakthrough for dozens of years, so he naturally lost interest in cultivating. If you give them medicinal pills now and let them see the hope of advancing, their hearts will naturally return to cultivating. They're not mortals. What else in this world is more attractive to them than advancing their cultivation realm? Yi Jinji suddenly understood. Right. Why didn't I think of that? Emo Tiange thought for a moment and said, you shouldn't give them too much. It'd be best if you tell them that when they send people to Mount Taikong in the future, you'll also send them medicinal pills and the like. That way, although they're in the secular world, they'll still feel the hope of cultivating. At that time, they'll naturally put their hearts into cultivating. Auntie, you're really thoughtful. Yi Jinji jumped up. I'll go right now. Wait. Yi Jinji stopped. Auntie, what's wrong? You can talk about this later. Right now, I have something to tell you. Huh? Emo Tiange said calmly. I came to Yi Clan this time just to send you off. Now that you've safely arrived, I'll leave tomorrow. Ah. Yi Jinji was a bit flustered. Auntie, are you going to let me stay here alone? Emo Tiange showed a faint smile. What? You don't dare? Yi Jinji was stunned and felt a bit embarrassed. For 10 years, he'd never left his aunt's side, so he immediately panicked. After calming down, he said, Auntie, I'm just a bit not used to it. Can't you stay a bit longer? Leaving sooner or leaving later, it's all the same. Emo Tiange reached out her hand, wanting to stroke his head like she did when he was a child. However, when she saw how big he was now, she withdrew her hand. Don't worry. I'll leave Xiaohu with you. Nothing will happen. I'm not afraid something will happen. Yi Jinji looked at her pitifully. Auntie, I don't want you to leave. He was already an adult, yet he still had this kind of expression. Emo Tiange couldn't help but laugh. You're already so big, yet you're still acting like a child. Yi Jinji rubbed his nose and also laughed. Knowing Emo Tiange was determined to leave, he settled for the next best thing. Auntie, how about I go with you? I'm going to travel, not to play. Emo Tiange explained patiently. If I take you with me, firstly, I don't know when I'll go back, and it'll be bad if I affect your foundation building. Secondly, I might go to some dangerous places, and I don't have enough strength to guarantee your safety. Yi Jinji didn't say anything. He wasn't an insensible child. He knew what Emo Tiange said was the truth, but he was just reluctant to part with her. All right, Auntie knows you're sensible. It's not like we won't come back. For us cultivators, we'll be separated for hundreds of years, let alone several years. The higher our cultivation level, the more it's like this. You have to get used to it. I understand. Yi Jinji nodded honestly. How could he not understand these principles? Cultivators cultivated longevity, but the most important thing to get used to in longevity was separation and loneliness. Small cultivators like them were fine. At most, they would enter closed-door meditation for more than a year. For cultivators above the core formation realm, they could easily enter closed-door meditation for dozens of years, or even hundreds of years. Cultivating to become an immortal was also about cultivating loneliness. Those who could not endure loneliness would ultimately not be able to cultivate the great Tao. Auntie, you have to be careful on the road. Send me messages often, or I'll be worried. Emotinga smiled. Although she was lonely, it was still warm to have someone caring for her. And you have to cultivate well. You can't neglect it, but you also can't be impatient. If you have any problems, go ask your grandmaster. Although your grandmaster has a strange temper, he sincerely supports the younger generation. If he says something, you must listen to him. I understand. Yi Zhenji nodded. He thought for a moment then asked, by the way, Auntie, what if my master comes out of closed-door meditation? Emotienga raised her eyebrows. Master is master. Is there still this and that? Yi Zhenji touched his head then said innocently, I said he's my master, but I've never seen him until today. Auntie is my real master. That master is just a cheap master I picked up. Hearing this title, Emotinga couldn't help but burst into laughter. Cheap master. The aunt and nephew duo really agreed on this point. Their masters were all picked up by others. By the way, Auntie, what does my master look like? Hualing said he saw him when he was a child, but he can't remember him clearly. Other senior martial brothers and sisters all say I'm lucky. My master is second to none among the younger generation in Xianqing School. He's already in the late stage of the core formation realm. If he succeeds in forming his nascent soul within 100 years, then I'll be really lucky. In any case, I'm too lucky. Yi Zhenji felt his words were too vulgar, so he hurriedly changed the subject. Emotinga was speechless. That was true. There was a world of difference between the advanced inner disciple of a core formation cultivator and the advanced inner disciple of a nascent soul cultivator. If Qin Shoujing really succeeded in forming his nascent soul, although Zhenji was only under his name, he would still be extraordinary. At that time, his disciple rations, Immortal's Cave, and resources would all be greatly different from what they were now. When she was still taught by martial uncle Xianin, she only had a bit of money. However, after she became Lord Taoist Jinghe's official disciple, her current net worth wasn't inferior to that of a core formation cultivator from an ordinary cultivation group. And when your grandmaster made you your master's advanced inner disciple in name, he indeed had this intention. However, your master is in closed-door meditation now, and we don't know when he'll come out. If he only forms his nascent soul and comes out after several hundred years, it won't be too bad for you. That's true. Yi Zhenji scratched his head. In any case, he didn't have high hopes for that, so he didn't feel depressed. The one who really taught him how to cultivate was his aunt. In any case, it didn't matter if he had that cheap master or not. Auntie, you haven't told me what my master looks like. Emotinga chuckled. What if I say I've never seen him before? Yi Zhenji's eyes widened. How could that be? They said the relationship between you and master isn't ordinary. Oh. Emotinga frowned slightly. How is it not ordinary? What did they say? They said, Auntie, you were originally recommended into the school by master. Grandmaster only accepted you as his disciple because of master. That's about it. Emotinga's expression softened. When I entered the school, your master was already a core formation cultivator. So why did he have to appear in person? Yi Zhenji thought for a moment then nodded. That's true. They're right. Your master is the cultivator with the highest chance of advancing to the nascent soul realm among the younger generation of Xianqing School. With his cultivation speed, it's not impossible for him to advance to the nascent soul realm in about 100 years. It's fine if your master doesn't come out of closed-door meditation during this time, but if he happens to come out, you still have to treat him with respect. This is also your grandmaster's idea. Yi Zhenji paused for a moment then said, but I already have an aunt. Master's only my master in name. Emotinga smiled bitterly at his childish words. Auntie's age and cultivation level are clear for all to see. Not to mention anything else, you'll only be building your foundation in about 10 years, so I definitely won't be able to advance to the core formation realm during this time. So I won't be able to help you that much. I'm not that materialistic. Yi Zhenji shouted. If it wasn't for Auntie, I wouldn't be who I am today. No matter how good that cheap master is, what does it have to do with me? Emotinga felt both happy and worried when she heard this. She was happy because in the past 10 years, she didn't teach this child to have a profit-seeking character. But she was worried because he didn't have enough experience and was too childish. In the end, she still warned him. You can forget about this in private, but you can't say it outside. I know. Don't worry, Auntie. Is there anything else you're not clear about? Upon hearing her question, Yi Jinji moved closer to her. Auntie, you have to come back soon. I'll try my best to build my foundation during this time. His words made Emotinga smile. In the end, she reached out her hand and stroked his head. You should go and accompany your mother. She hasn't seen you for many years. She misses you very much and talks about you all the time. You should tell her everything you need to tell her. Don't let your mother worry. I know. Emotinga withdrew her hand, then opened the restriction. She then sat cross-legged and closed her eyes. Yi Jinji hesitated for a while, reluctant to part with her, but in the end, he finally left. Emotinga only opened her eyes when she heard the sound of the door closing. Her eyes were filled with worry. This child is really like me in the past. Or maybe I didn't think things through carefully enough. Although I gave him enough care, I let him develop a dependent personality. Just like back then, she relied on second uncle. When he lost him, she was in so much pain that she wished she was dead. It wasn't that this kind of deep affection wasn't good, but deep affection required a magnanimous mind to accommodate. According to the Taoist scriptures, absolute oblivion didn't mean that one was heartless. Oblivion meant that one couldn't be moved by emotions. This was the principle of forgetfulness. It wasn't that cultivators couldn't have attachments. There were also people with magnanimous minds who loved each other and raised children and grandchildren, which didn't affect their cultivation. However, ordinary disciples couldn't do that. Therefore, cultivation groups disapproved of disciples having too much contact with their clans. Yi Jinji was facing this kind of problem now. After living together for 10 years, he was like a teacher, like a father, like a mother, like a brother, just like the feelings she had for second uncle in the past. But it was also because he was too young. Emotinga recalled that she lost second uncle at this age. If Qin hadn't been by her side to support her, maybe she wouldn't have been able to stand up so quickly. When she thought of this name, she felt a stabbing pain in her heart, but she soon calmed down. This was her luck, but it was also her fate. If it wasn't because of this, it might take a long time for her to recover her mental state. If it wasn't because of this, she wouldn't have fallen in love with someone so easily. Fortunately, she rationally cut off this feeling. Later, she vaguely realized some things, which made her even more grateful for her decision at that time. Thinking up to this point, Emotinga rubbed the space between her eyebrows and shook her head. Forget it. She shouldn't think too much. She was herself, and Jinji was Jinji. The difference between men and women was also reflected in their personalities. Maybe during the time she was away, Jinji would come into contact with other people more, and this dependence would fade. As for seeing through it, that would depend on fated chances. Early the next morning, Emotinga packed her things and left Yi Clan. Everyone in Yi Clan came out to see her off. Last night, Emotinga asked Yi Jinji to give some medicinal pills, spirit tools, and other things she didn't use to Yi Clan's patriarch as a gift from a senior. Yi Clan was deeply grateful for this. Yi Clan had been in the secular world for a long time, so they had long run out of savings. Back when they sent Yi Jinji to the mountain, they only took out 2 or 3 spirit stones and several medicinal pills, which clearly showed how poor their resources were. Because Emotinga was Yi Jinji's martial uncle, she took out more than 10 bottles of medicinal pills and spirit tools, which were indeed huge wealth for Yi Clan. In fact, those medicinal pills were leftovers from when she learned how to concoct medicinal pills, and the spirit tools were also collected from the cultivators she killed years ago. None of them were good things, so she didn't give them to Yi Jinji, and just casually threw them in a corner of her Qianquan bag. Now she could use them. Jinji, I'll leave Xiaohua to you. Take good care of it. When you go back, bring it back to the school, understand? Yi Jinji nodded and took the Inferno Beast. In the past 10 years, he could be said to have grown up with Xiaohua. The relationship between man and beast was very good, so he naturally carried Xiaohua. When everyone in Yi clan saw this Inferno Beast, their eyes widened. Several cultivators from Yi clan could see that this Inferno Beast was a second-rank spiritual beast. A second-rank spiritual beast was equivalent to an early-stage foundation-building cultivator. Yet he actually gave it to Yi Jinji, just like that. Senior. Yi Qing stepped forward, pointed at the Inferno Beast in Yi Jinji's arms, and said in fear and trepidation, "Giving this spiritual beast to Zhener isn't too good, is it?" Mo Tiange turned to look at him and asked, "Does Patriarchy think there's a problem?" Yi Qing said, "This is a second-rank spiritual beast, so it should be able to help you. If you give it to Zhener, what will you do for yourself?" Mo Tiange said faintly, "Even if this spiritual beast stays with me, it won't be of much use, so it'd be better to let Jinji take care of it. Rest assured, Patriarchy, Xiaohua grew up with Jinji, so their relationship is very good. It won't hurt Jinji." "That's not what I meant." Mo Tiange knew he was just worried, so she waved her hand and interrupted him. "Patriarchy, rest assured. All right, Jinji, Martial Uncle will leave now. You stay at home for several months, but remember to return to the school on time. If you miss the test, the next time will be 3 years later." "I know, Martial Uncle. Rest assured, I know all of this. And then I'll leave now. You don't need to see me off." After she said that, she no longer spoke any nonsense. With a wave of her hand, the white silk handkerchief appeared. Then she transformed into a flight light and disappeared into the horizon. Chapter 155. The white silk handkerchief rose up, and a flight light flashed by. This kind of flying technique made the low-level cultivators of Yi clan extremely envious. When the other cultivators in Tong and City felt the pressure of a foundation-building cultivator, their expressions changed. Only when the pressure was far away did they dare to look around. Mo Tiange rode the white silk handkerchief until she was some distance away from Tong and City. She then retracted her spiritual aura pressure. The reason why he deliberately revealed the aura of a foundation establishment cultivator in Tong and City was to intimidate others, to let them know that the Yi clan had connections with a foundation establishment cultivator, so that they wouldn't be bullied by others. This was the secular world. Most of the itinerant cultivators in the secular world had no hope of reaching the Great Tao, and their cultivation was between the first to the third layer. A foundation establishment cultivator was enough to intimidate them. The flight light of a foundation building cultivator wasn't slow, and the white silk handkerchief was an excellent flying magic weapon. In less than half a day, they had already left Wei country. When she was in Yi clan, Yi Cheng gave her some of the information Yi clan had collected in the secular world in the past several decades. However, most of the spirit veins in the celestial pole were concentrated in Kunwu, and even if there were spirit veins in the secular world, they were very weak. Even some small cultivation groups weren't interested in them, so naturally, they couldn't be considered fated chances. Therefore, Mo Tiange didn't plan to explore the secret places provided by Yi clan. She only planned to pick some spiritual plants, or find some spiritual objects in some special places. To the southeast of the Wei Kingdom was the Jin Kingdom. Mo Tiange also planned to take a trip to the Mo family's village in Lianqing City, to pay her respects to her mother, and retrieve her mother's remains. If she had the chance, she would be buried with her father in the future. Back then, when her father died on Demonic Mountain, Qin Shoujing brought news back, saying that his body was buried on Demonic Mountain. She already had a plan in her heart. If she could form her gold core in the future, when the restrictions on Demonic Mountain weakened again, she would take a trip to retrieve her father's remains and bury him with her mother. This could also be considered fulfilling her mother's lifelong wish. At the same time, he also wanted to inform them of Tianxiao's death. When he was young, he only felt that the family was cold. If it wasn't for Tianxiao, he wouldn't even want to stay there for a day. Now, she was no longer the orphan girl who had lost her parents. Instead, she was an immortal cultivator who could fly in the sky and tunnel through the earth. Thinking back to the past, she could only sigh. Actually, her grandparents weren't bad people, but for a child, they didn't give her enough affection. She could understand, but it was difficult for her to get close to them. As soon as she entered Jing country's territory, a frown appeared on her face. She changed the direction of her flight and headed northeast. This was because she felt a strange spiritual aura fluctuation. It didn't seem like a battle of magical powers between cultivators, and it also didn't seem like the spiritual aura pressure of a high-level cultivator. Emo Tienga only hesitated for a moment before she decided to go and take a look. The spiritual energy turbulence wasn't that great, but it was a bit strange. This was the secular world, so presumably, there weren't any high-level cultivators here. Now that she had a certain level of cultivation and several treasures on her, she shouldn't be in any danger. Nevertheless, the closer she got, the deeper the frown on her face became. This spiritual aura turbulence was clean and pure, and she could faintly hear the sound of wind and thunder. Could it be that a unique treasure had been born? With this thought in mind, she cast an art and urged the white silk handkerchief to move forward with all her might. Then she spread her divine sense out. Sure enough, she discovered other cultivators were also rushing over. However, these cultivators were only in the aura refining realm. When her divine sense touched them, they knew there were foundation building seniors here, so they immediately slowed down. The more Emotinga flew, the stranger she felt. This spiritual aura didn't seem to be as close as she thought. She'd been flying for so long, but she didn't feel like the distance between them was getting any closer. Gradually, this spiritual aura turbulence attracted the attention of even more cultivators in the secular world. After flying for several hours, Emotienga began to sense that there were also foundation-building cultivators joining the ranks of the pursuers. Although most of the individual cultivators in the secular world were low-level aura refining cultivators, there were also cultivators in the foundation-building realm and above who happened to pass by. Maybe they were like her and happened to discover this spiritual aura turbulence, so they chased after it. These foundation-building cultivators tacitly kept some distance from each other, but they spared no effort in flying in that direction. Several more hours passed, and the spiritual aura turbulence finally became a bit more obvious. Many of the foundation-building cultivators were overjoyed and sped up. Emotinga's white silk handkerchief was naturally much better than these cultivators flying magic tools. However, when she discovered other foundation-building cultivators, she no longer urged it with all her strength, and instead maintained a speed that was roughly the same as theirs. The reason for this was because she was used to being cautious. This spiritual aura turbulence was very abnormal. Rather than running in the front alone, it would be safer for her to travel with these people. If there really was some kind of unique treasure, she wouldn't be afraid of them since she swept her gaze over them just now and discovered that these foundation-building cultivators were all early-stage cultivators. At this time, the closer they flew, the more obvious the spiritual aura turbulence became. Emotienga knew the source wasn't too far away. The flight lights of the other cultivators were already visible to the naked eye. There were many people who had the same idea as her, but they all avoided her. After all, her cultivation level was in the peak of the middle stage, so she was the strongest among them. Right now, they still didn't know whether she was a friend or a foe, so it was better for her to stay as far away as possible. At this time, there were no longer any aura refining cultivators following them. Even if some aura refining cultivators sensed the spiritual aura turbulence and flew up, they were suppressed by the spiritual aura pressure of these foundation-building cultivators, and eventually gave up the pursuit. The spiritual aura turbulence became increasingly clear. Emotinga's divine sense had already sensed the source of the spiritual aura turbulence. At the same time, she also sensed other cultivators' divine senses brushing past her. She also saw cultivators rushing over from other directions. Emotinga pondered for a moment, then stepped on the white silk handkerchief. Her speed suddenly became faster, leaving the foundation-building cultivators behind as she flew straight towards the source of the spiritual aura. Upon seeing the white flight light disappearing into the horizon, the faces of the foundation-building cultivators, who had been flying together with her for several hours, turned ashen. With this kind of speed, She could have left them behind a long time ago. It seemed that this fellow Taoist was just being lenient. Now that she suddenly sped up, did she discover something? With this thought in mind, several foundation-building cultivators also sped up and chased after her. Only one of them muttered to himself, "Her flight light is actually white. It seems this person isn't someone to be trifled with. It's better to slow down a bit." The color of a flight light was always consistent with one's spiritual roots, and the cultivation technique they mainly cultivated. Gold was golden, wood was cyan, water was blue, fire was red, and earth was yellow. For cultivators with mixed spiritual roots, their flight lights were, at most, mixed colors. It was absolutely impossible for their flight lights to be white. Unless that person was a rare foundation-building cultivator with 5 spiritual roots, or a cultivator who practiced a special cultivation technique, it was impossible for a person with 5 spiritual roots to have a white flight light. Foundation-building cultivators with 5 spiritual roots had experienced many hardships that ordinary people couldn't compare to. Cultivators who practiced special cultivation techniques mostly had strange moves. No matter what kind of move they practiced, they were stronger than ordinary cultivators. Unfortunately, the other foundation-building cultivators were too eager to get their hands on the treasure and didn't think about this point. 2 hours later, Emotinga landed on a cliff. At this moment, a group of cultivators had gathered on the cliff. Among them were 3 foundation-building cultivators and more than 10 aura refining cultivators. They all looked different, but they were all staring at the valley below the cliff. Upon seeing Emotinga land, some of the foundation-building cultivators were happy, while some were worried. On the contrary, the more than 10 aura refining cultivators were indifferent and expressionless. Fellow Taoist, Emotinga was still observing the valley faintly emitting spiritual aura, when a foundation-building cultivator, with a grizzled beard, came to greet her, and cupped his hands politely. Emotinga had already observed the people here. She didn't need to pay too much attention to those aura-refining cultivators, since they were probably individual cultivators in the secular world. There were 3 foundation-building cultivators. One of them was a man and a woman about 30 years old. They looked intimate, and seemed to be dual cultivation companions. Both of them were in the early stage of the foundation-building realm, and there was nothing special about their appearance or clothes. There was also this Taoist who was standing together with the man and woman just now. They seemed to be friends, or had reached a mutual agreement. This Taoist was in the middle stage of the foundation-building realm. He had white hair and a ruddy complexion, and his cultivation level was quite high. Since the other party was so polite, Emotinga also saluted him back. This Taoist had secretly peeked at her cultivation level a long time ago. Seeing that she still looked like a young girl, but had such a high cultivation level, he was inwardly shocked. In the cultivation world, although cultivation techniques with the effect of retaining one's youth weren't rare, they weren't common either. Individual cultivators most likely couldn't get their hands on such cultivation techniques. This Taoist secretly speculated that if Emotinga's youthful appearance was due to the cultivation technique she practiced, then she was most likely someone from a cultivation group. If it wasn't because of the cultivation technique she practiced, it would be even more frightening for her to have such a high cultivation level at such a young age. Because of this, his attitude was both polite and respectful. "My Taoist name is Fangzheng. May I know how I should address fellow Taoist?" Emotinga's gaze swept over this person, but she didn't give him her real name. "I'm Yi Xiaotian. Nice to meet you." After leaving Mount Taikong, she had already changed out of her cultivation group's uniform. Her name was also an alias, and she rarely walked outside, so presumably no one would recognize her. "So it's fellow Taoist Yi." Taoist Fangzheng once again cupped his hands towards her, then went straight to the point. "Fellow Taoist, you must have noticed the spiritual aura fluctuation here." So she rushed over to take a look. Emotinga nodded. Yes. Her gaze once again fell on the valley below the cliff. This place didn't look like a spirit vein no matter how she looked at it. And this valley also didn't look special. So why was there spiritual aura here? Taoist Fangzheng smiled. What a coincidence. These two fellow Taoists, and I also came to take a look because of this. Is that so? Emotienga answered faintly. She already guessed this Taoist's intention. Presumably, he wanted to invite her to go down the valley together. However, this valley didn't seem special. So why didn't the three of them, foundation-building cultivators, dare to go down? Taoist Fangjing looked a bit embarrassed to see her cold attitude. But Emotienga's cultivation level was slightly higher than his. So he endured it. Fellow Taoist Yi, Brother Yao his wife, and I have already examined the valley. Oh. Emotienga finally shifted her gaze from the valley to him. Taoist Fangjing smiled and said, Fellow Taoist Yi, are you wondering why we stopped here and didn't go down the valley? Emotienga nodded. Indeed, the spiritual pressure wasn't strong. The three foundation-building cultivators didn't move, and the dozen or so aura-refining cultivators were still standing on the cliff's edge, whispering to each other, but none of them made any moves to go down. This was indeed strange. To tell you the truth, fellow Taoist, Brother Yao his wife, and I rushed here just now. Then we went down the valley separately. Who would have thought the miasma and gales in this valley would be so powerful? We could block them once, but we couldn't block them twice. In the end, we had no choice but to come back up. Miasma and gales? Emotienga was rather astonished. If they were miasma and gales, how could the spiritual aura fluctuations be so gentle? Although there were faint sounds of wind and thunder, they were neutral and peaceful. Logically speaking, there shouldn't be any harmful miasma or gales. Taoist Fangjing smiled bitterly at her expression. If fellow Taoist Yi doesn't believe me, you can go down and take a look yourself. Emotienga's astonishment disappeared, but she soon regained her composure. She said, No need. I presume fellow Taoist has no reason to deceive me. Correct, little sister. This is the truth. Right after she finished speaking, the brother Yao and his wife, Taoist Fangjing mentioned, walked over. The woman was dressed like a married woman. She was about 27 or 28 years old, charming, graceful, and had a smile on her face. When she spoke, her tone was soft but straightforward, giving her a very favorable impression. Once the woman finished speaking, the male cultivator next to her frowned and said helplessly, Little Sister Wan, this young lady's cultivation level is higher than ours. So how could you call her little sister so casually? That's too rude. He then turned around and cupped his hands towards Emotienga apologetically. Fellow Taoist Yi, I'm really sorry. My wife is outspoken and didn't mean to offend you. Before Emotienga could answer, the woman said angrily, Big brother Xiao, don't rush to apologize on my behalf. I'll bet with you that this little sister is really a little sister. The conversation between the husband and wife had another layer of meaning. The male cultivator reminded his wife that Emotienga's cultivation level was higher than theirs, and that she might even be a bit older than them. Calling her little sister might be offensive, but mentioning a woman's age to her face would also offend her, so he didn't say anything. The woman understood her husband's meaning, so she focused on little sister. Once the woman finished speaking, her husband asked in confusion, How can you be so sure? The woman just smiled. It's a woman's intuition. As she spoke, she walked towards Emotienga, then affectionately pulled her hand and asked, Little sister, am I right or am I not? Emotienga also smiled. May I know how old you and your wife are? If you don't tell me, I won't be able to answer. The woman was stunned, but she soon covered her mouth and laughed. Look at my brain. I actually forgot such an important matter. My humble husband and I are only 100 years old this year. Based on the lifespan of foundation-building cultivators, this was their real appearance. 100 years old, early-stage foundation building. Emotienga thought to herself that this couple was most likely not cultivators from small cultivation groups, but individual cultivators. If they were cultivators from big cultivation groups, they were probably ordinary disciples. Most elite disciples from big cultivation groups had built their foundation early. Although not many of them formed their gold core, it wasn't a problem for them to cultivate to the middle or late stage of the foundation building realm. Very few of them stayed in the early stage of the foundation building realm at this age. Big sister's guess is correct. Emotienga showed a faint smile. I'm a bit younger than you too. Oh, Not only this couple, but Daoist Fengjing's eyes also brightened. She was less than 100 years old, but her cultivation level was already in the peak of the middle stage of the foundation building realm. Mo Tiange didn't want to talk too much about this, so she changed the subject. How much do the three of you know about the situation in this valley? Daoist Fengjing regained his train of thought and immediately answered, Brother Yao, his wife, and I discovered that we couldn't pass through the miasma and gales inside, so the three of us joined hands, but the result was the same. Fellow Taoists, take a look. Although the spiritual aura isn't intense, it's very pure. It's most likely the birth of some unique treasure. It'd be a pity if we missed it. Yes, us husband and wife also thought the same. The one who took over the conversation was the woman. Little sister, I can see you're so young, but your cultivation level is already so high. You must be a disciple of a cultivation group, right? The three of us are individual cultivators, so it's really not easy for us to encounter the birth of a unique treasure. If you're also interested in the treasure, we can think of a way together. If you don't want to take risks, we won't stop you. Of course, if you think you can do it alone, just pretend you never heard our suggestion. Chapter 156. The woman's tone was gentle, but her words were straightforward. Right after she finished speaking, her husband pulled her again with a somewhat helpless expression. Mo Tiange could roughly guess what the male cultivator was thinking. This woman was really straightforward. If she was a hot-tempered person, she would probably be unhappy after hearing what she said. Mo Tiange was disinclined to get angry. Besides, this woman was just a bit too straightforward with her words. She didn't offend her. She said, Big sister is right. Let me think about it. The woman beamed with joy. That's what you should do. Little sister, think about it carefully. The male cultivator heaved a sigh of relief when he saw that she didn't take advantage of her higher cultivation level to attack them. Although there were two of them, their cultivation levels were a bit lower than others. Even if they joined hands, they would still lose more if they fought against cultivators in the peak of the middle stage of the foundation building realm. Daoist Fengjing raised his head to look at the horizon. Fellow Taoist Yi, we'd better make a decision quickly. The longer we delay, the more people will come. Mo Tiange was a bit surprised. This Daoist Fengjing's divine sense was also very powerful. She only sensed someone approaching just now. That being the case, we'd better get going quickly. The three of them were delighted to hear what she said. Daoist Fengjing looked around, then quickly laid a soundproof barrier. He said, Fellow Taoist Yi, may I ask what kind of cultivation technique you practice? Upon seeing Mo Tiange's unhappy expression, he immediately added, The miasma and gales below us are very strong. Fellow Taoist Yi, you'd better have a cultivation technique that can restrain them. Mo Tiange thought for a while, then answered, Although I don't have a cultivation technique, I have a magic weapon that can resist the gales. Hearing what she said, the other three people beamed with joy. Daoist Fengjing clapped his hands. That's great. If we're talking about the miasma, I have a kind of detoxifying pill that's very effective. After you swallow it, you just need to hold your breath and circulate your cultivation technique. Fellow Taoist Yi, can your magic weapon protect the four of us from the gales? We'll have to see to know. After their brief discussion, the four of them took out their flying magic tools under the envious gazes of many aura refining cultivators and fell into the valley. What Mo Tiange took out was an ordinary flying sword. Firstly, the white silk handkerchief had to take on the role of resisting the gales on this journey. Secondly, she wanted to hide her wealth. The white silk handkerchief was a magic weapon. It was already eye-catching to take it out, but now it was discovered by others that it had so many functions. It was inevitable that people would be envious. From the short conversation they had just now, Mo Tiange found out that the man was called Yao Zixio, and the woman was called Shang Ruan. They were born in a cultivation family and had been childhood sweethearts. Later, when the family declined, the two of them became loose cultivators. It had to be said that the two of them were extremely lucky. They had inadvertently saved a severely injured nascent soul cultivator. That nascent soul cultivator was grateful for the two of them saving his life. and had given them several foundation-building pills in return. With these foundation-building pills, the two of them unexpectedly reached the foundation-building realm together. Originally, with their status as foundation-building cultivators, it wouldn't have been difficult for them to find a small cultivation group to stay in. However, they were already used to wandering the world and didn't like being tied down. Furthermore, their aptitudes weren't outstanding, so even if they found a cultivation group, it would be difficult for them to advance to the core formation realm. It would be better for them to remain as loose cultivators, which would be a bit more enjoyable. Emotinga saw that Shang Ruan was frank, open-minded, and her mental state was even more carefree than many elite disciples in cultivation groups, so her evaluation of her improved by a notch. Her husband, Yao Zixio, was rather taciturn and a bit more tactful than her, so they complemented each other perfectly. The two of them were very harmonious and looked very loving. As for Taoist Fangzheng, he was also an individual cultivator. He was quite old and had a lot of experience, but his temperament couldn't be seen yet. The three of them guessed she was a disciple of a cultivation group. Emotinga didn't deny it, and just vaguely said she was passing by and happened to run into them, so she came to see what was going on. As they flew down from the valley, they saw that the valley was filled with fog, and the bottom couldn't be seen. After flying down for a while, they soon reached the edge of the miasma. Taoist Fangzheng gave his detoxification pills to the three of them. Emotinga took them, but didn't swallow them. Instead, she secretly swapped them for her own medicinal pills. This Taoist Fangzheng didn't seem suspicious, but they'd just met after all, so it was better to be a bit more cautious. Right after that, Emotinga summoned the white silk handkerchief and chanted an incantation. In a flash, the white silk handkerchief turned into bricks which fell from all sides and surrounded the four of them like a house, trapping them inside. This was the result of her 5 years of closed-door meditation. In the beginning, this white silk handkerchief could only turn into a brick wall, but after her cultivation level increased, it could turn into more bricks, and its defense also became stronger. Under the protection of the brick wall, formed by the white silk handkerchief, the four of them cautiously flew down. The miasma wasn't serious. After they flew down for a while, the wind started to howl outside. The sound of the wind became more and more violent. It was so sharp that it sounded like it was tearing something apart, as it ruthlessly hit the brick wall. Emotinga wrinkled her brows slightly. This gale was indeed fierce. If this white silk handkerchief hadn't been refined by a deification cultivator, and wasn't an ordinary magic weapon, it probably wouldn't have been able to withstand it. Shang Ruan looked worried when she saw Emotinga's slightly pale face. She asked in a low voice, "Little sister Yi, can you hold on?" With a pale face, Emotinga said, "I don't have enough spiritual aura. You two husband and wife, give me a hand." Shang Ruan and Yao Zixio glanced at each other, then made hand seals together. Yao Zixio passed his spiritual aura to Shang Ruan, and Shang Ruan passed her spiritual aura to Emotinga. As for Taoist Fangzheng, he was on full alert to guard against any mishaps. The gale became fiercer and fiercer. The three of them gradually ran out of spiritual aura, so they had to take medicinal pills. Because Taoist Fangzheng provided them with medicinal pills to ward off the miasma, and Emotinga used her magic weapon to block the gale, the Yao couple didn't contribute anything, but the two of them didn't dare to complain. They just kept eating restorative panaceas and transferred all their spiritual aura to Emotinga. Time gradually passed. The Yao couple finally finished their restorative panaceas. Yao Zixio touched his Qingquan bag, then asked Shang Ruan in a low voice, "Little sister Wan, do you have any more restorative panaceas?" Shang Ruan's complexion gradually turned pale. She shook her head and said, "This is the last bottle." They were only ordinary individual cultivators, so their families weren't rich. Emotinga swallowed another restorative panaceas, then said, "Fellow Taoist Fangzheng, how about you take their place?" Now that the four of them were on the same boat, how could Taoist Fangzheng refuse? He nodded and said, "Brother Yao, you and your wife should rest for a while. I still have some restorative panaceas on me, so it won't be a problem for us to hold on for a while." The Yao couple had already used up their medicinal pills, so how could they refuse? Yao Zixio said. In that case, we won't be polite. Daoist Fangjing put his palms together and moved his spiritual aura into Mo Tiange's body through her back. Now that Yao Zixio and Shang Ruan were free, they seized this time to close their eyes and rest. At that moment, there was a whooshing sound outside. All of a sudden, several gusts of gale attacked them, hitting the brick wall outside heavily. For a moment, Mo Tiange lost control of the brick wall, causing the four of them to suddenly feel dizzy. Shang Ruan called out, "Big brother Xiao." Yao Zixio hastily rushed over. The two of them held each other's hands tightly and steadied themselves together. Mo Tiange and Fangjing's cultivation levels were higher than theirs, so their adaptability was also faster than theirs. Once Mo Tiange realized she was losing control of her magic weapon, she immediately bit the tip of her tongue and spat out a mouthful of blood essence, forcibly regaining control of the magic weapon. Daoist Fangjing also immediately moved his spiritual aura again, sending it into Mo Tiange's body. After the torrent passed and the four of them regained their stability, Mo Tiange said, "The situation isn't good. If the gale was a bit stronger, my magic weapon wouldn't be able to hold on." What she said made the other three people wrinkle their brows. They had experienced it themselves, so they naturally knew how powerful the gale was. Right now, the Yao couple had used up all their restorative panaceas and didn't have enough spiritual aura, so even protecting themselves would be a problem. Although Daoist Fangjing still had some strength left, if Mo Tiange couldn't hold on, he wouldn't be able to survive the gale without the protection of the white silk handkerchief. While they were hesitating, another torrent came. This time, Mo Tiange was already prepared. She had been using her divine sense to firmly control the white silk handkerchief, but this time, the torrent was even stronger. Even though Mo Tiange's divine sense was powerful, she still felt powerless even though she wanted to. She made a prompt decision and shouted, "This won't do. We have to go back." Nevertheless, Daoist Fangjing was hesitant. We're almost at the bottom, aren't we?" Mo Tiange raised her voice. "If it comes again, I won't be able to hold on." "Fellow Daoist Fangjing, can you guarantee you'll be able to hold on?" What she said made Daoist Fangjing silent. His cultivation level was slightly lower than Mo Tiange's, so if Mo Tiange couldn't hold on, he wouldn't be able to either. Another gale attacked them. Shang Ruan's complexion turned pale, and she spat out a mouthful of blood. Yao Zixio turned pale with fright. "Little sister Wan." Mo Tiange no longer said anything. She immediately manipulated the flying sword to change its flying direction. If this continued, she might lose her life here. She wasn't an individual cultivator. She had a sect and a master, and she had outstanding talents, so she didn't lack medicinal pills. Even if she didn't have this kind of unique treasure, she still had a chance to advance to the great Tao. If she lost her life for something that might not even exist, she would lose more than she gained. Upon seeing her changing direction, Fangjing called out, "Fellow Daoist Yi." He seemed reluctant. Mo Tiange said coldly, "If we don't go back, we'll all die here. No matter how good a treasure is, it depends on whether we're alive to enjoy it." Daoist Fangjing's face flushed, but he didn't say anything in the end. Unlike these people, he didn't have much time left in his lifespan, so he had to seize every opportunity he could. However, if he offended this little girl now, he would die here without the protection of her magic weapon. He stared at the bottom of the ravine, which was visible to the naked eye, with an unwilling expression on his face. Yao Zixio was also unwilling. Shang Ruan said softly, "Big brother Xiao, the most important thing is for us to be together and live well." Yao Zixio was silent for a long time before he finally let out a soft "N." The four of them flew upward in silence. The gales finally weren't as fierce as before, so the four of them felt a bit relieved. All of a sudden, a rumbling sound rang out. The Yao couple looked up and immediately turned pale with fright. "Fellow Taoists." Mo Tiange followed their line of sight and looked up. Her eyes immediately widened. A part of the mountain wall was cracked by the gales and was falling towards them. "Brother Yao, quickly block it!" Daoist Fangjing shouted. The Yao couple finally regained their senses. They hastily joined hands to make hand seals, creating a protective cover above everyone's heads. This brick wall, transformed from the white silk handkerchief, only had 4 sides, so it couldn't block the falling stones, so they could only rely on this protective cover. Emotinga's heart sank when she saw this. Without any time to think about anything else, she put her hand into her Qingquan bag, grabbed a handful of medicinal pills, and stuffed them into her mouth. Right after that, she felt a huge tremor around her body. All the stones were falling towards them. The Yao couple managed to withstand the first wave of stones. The second wave, the protective cover shook and its light dimmed. The third wave, the protective cover finally broke. Emotinga suddenly lost control of the brick wall. She immediately clasped her palms together, and the 4 sides of the brick wall transformed back into the white silk handkerchief. She made a hand seal, wanting to return to the virtual sky world, but she couldn't even hold on for a short period of time. In an instant, she was sucked into the raging gales. After an indeterminate amount of time, Emotinga slowly opened her eyes. Pain. Her whole body ached. She closed her eyes and moved her spiritual aura to flow through her meridians one by one. Only then did the pain in her body ease a bit. After a long time, she finally regained the strength and slowly sat up. She looked around. The scene in front of her surprised her. The grass was green, the sun was shining, the breeze was gentle, and the water was gurgling. Everything in front of her was like a beautiful paradise. She recalled what happened before she fainted. She discovered spiritual aura fluctuations, searched for them, went down the valley with the Yao couple and Taoist Fangzheng, encountered gales. In the end, she wanted to enter the virtual sky world, but she didn't make it in time. She was sucked into the gales and lost consciousness. She touched her body, but she wasn't injured. Her dantian and meridians were extremely tough, so they weren't damaged. The reason why she didn't have any external injuries was because she was wearing the heaven and earth cloud silk armor. She stole this magic tool from Yunwu Sect's Guiyuan Hall when she left Mount Yunwu, and gave it to her along with the land-fleeing ruler. The land-fleeing ruler once saved her life, and this heaven and earth cloud silk armor also saved her life now. Emotinga wiped away her messy thoughts and stood up. This was indeed a valley, but it was completely different from the previous valley filled with fog, miasma, and gales. What kind of place was this? How did she get here? She summoned the white silk handkerchief, stepped on it, and flew into the air. Looking down from the sky, this was a T-shaped valley surrounded by steep mountain walls. Aside from flying up, she couldn't find an exit. Emotinga cautiously flew along the rock walls. She didn't know what happened to the Yao couple and Taoist Fangzheng. The Yao couple were 2 people, and Taoist Fangzheng was very experienced, so he should have some self-defense methods. This place was filled with birds and fragrant flowers. The trees and grass were lush, and there were even harmless little beasts running around occasionally. Presumably, there shouldn't be any danger, right? Her gaze swept over the area below, and she suddenly found something black. Emotinga wrinkled her brows and started to descend. That thing seemed to be a pile of stones. The further she went down, the clearer she could see it. It seemed to be a stone statue. Emotinga's spirit was aroused and she continued to descend. The existence of a stone statue meant there were traces of people living here. Since there were traces of people living here, she could ask them to find out what this place was and what was going on. Once she landed on the ground, Emotinga looked up. This stone statue was several hundred feet tall. Based on its facial features and posture, it seemed to be a woman. Her hair was tied up in a high bun with a phoenix hairpin, and her clothes were a bit strange. She wore a short jacket that tightly wrapped around her upper body, exposing her entire shoulders, while her lower body was covered in a long skirt. Although it was a statue, it gave off an elegant and spirited feeling. This kind of clothes seemed to be worn several thousand years ago. Several thousand years ago, women didn't need to wrap themselves tightly like they did today. They were beautiful by exposing their shoulders, but they liked to wear long skirts, which made them look like fairies, as if they were flying in the sky in a painting. Emotinga examined the stone statue carefully. It was covered in moss, and it seemed like no one had taken care of it for a long time. She was a bit disappointed. It seemed the people in the valley had most likely moved away. There was a stone platform under the stone statue, which seemed to be an altar. The incense burner was also full of weeds. Emotinga suddenly wrinkled her brows. She placed her hand on the incense burner on the altar and gave it a light push, causing a faint spiritual aura to emerge. Chapter 157. Emotinga's spirit was lifted when she found spiritual aura on the incense burner on the altar. This valley was clearly an ordinary one. The flowers and trees here didn't have spiritual aura, but this incense burner actually had spiritual aura, so it must be unusual. After examining it for a while, she finally used a spell to move the incense burner away, and finally found the source of the spiritual aura. While flying in the air, Emotinga looked down. The altar, the stone statues, and the surrounding tall trees were clearly a formation that didn't need spiritual aura after it evolved. The corners of her mouth curled up slightly. There were also formations in the mortal world. Those formations didn't need spiritual aura, but they were evolved from formations in the cultivation world. Their purpose was to confuse the judgment of mortals. If cultivators used their divine sense and magic, they would naturally be able to break them. Emotinga put her palms together and cast a spell. The incense burner on the altar instantly exploded, revealing the things inside. Spiritual aura soared into the sky, and the surrounding scenery suddenly changed. The sky darkened. Emotinga raised her head and looked around with a frown. A formation within a formation. This formation was a real formation from the world of cultivators. The stone statues and altars she saw just now were all gone, leaving only an empty wilderness. No, this was an illusion. She held the shuttle of flying Apsara in her hand and summoned the white silk handkerchief. Emotinga instantly flew up and made a hand seal. After making several extremely complicated hand seals, several spiritual auras were sent out at the same time. Whistling sounds came from the dark night, like the whimpers and roars of malicious spirits. Then several spiritual auras counterattacked. Emotinga shook her hand and summoned the white silk handkerchief, which turned into 4 brick walls and firmly blocked the counterattack. In the next moment, she put away the white silk handkerchief and took out the shuttle of flying Apsara, which turned into several golden lights and attacked. Puff, 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 puff. After several soft sounds, everything quieted down and the sky brightened. Emotinga breathed a sigh of relief. This formation had been around for thousands of years, so its spiritual aura was already weak, and its power was greatly reduced. That was why she could break it so easily. However, based on the technique used to lay this formation, its original power would probably even trap a nascent soul cultivator for a while. Could it be that the person who laid this formation was a nascent soul cultivator? With this thought in her mind, Emotinga cautiously observed her surroundings. The formation was broken, and the scenery returned to its original appearance. A hole appeared under the incense burner, and spiritual energy surged out. Emotinga was flabbergasted. There were obviously no spirit veins in this valley, so why did this cave emit such pure spiritual aura? This spiritual aura fluctuation was very similar to what she had felt before. Upon discovering this, Emotinga cautiously approached it. She first used magic to probe it, then caught a live animal and put it inside. Only after confirming that there were no abnormalities did she slowly step inside. The cave entrance was extremely narrow, probably only wide enough for one person to pass through. Following the stone steps, they walked down step by step until they reached a spacious hall. Emotinga flicked her finger, causing a cluster of flames to appear on her fingertip. With the eyesight of an immortal cultivator, although they could see things in the dark, it was very difficult. If there was an open flame, they would be able to see clearly. He raised his head and looked around. This hall was chiseled into the stone wall, and it looked like a cave. Could it be the cave of an ancient cultivator? After a brief moment of excitement, Emotinga suddenly thought of something. No, that stone statue just now was obviously a person from several thousand years ago, so it shouldn't have anything to do with ancient cultivators. He walked past the hall and slowly walked along the stone path. The hall was very dark, but the spiritual aura was very dense. Emotienga concluded that this was a small spirit vein that had been sealed by someone with a formation. Apparently, this was most likely a cultivator's cave, and this cultivator's cultivation level was definitely above the nascent soul realm. With this conclusion, Emotienga's interest was finally piqued. Since the formation was still there, this cave shouldn't be an abandoned one. If that was the case, this nascent soul cultivator most likely passed away in this cave. What did the cave of a nascent soul cultivator passing away represent? This cave must contain the cultivator's treasures. Emotienga took out the shuttle of flying Apsara and circled around her vigilantly. After coming to this conclusion, Emotienga became even more cautious. The long stone path was filled with boundless darkness. After walking for a while, Emotienga suddenly felt a chill run down her spine. Although she was already an immortal in the eyes of mortals, she still felt a bit scared when faced with this kind of scene. She recalled her previous adventures. They were just killing each other. She had never faced the ignorant darkness alone. In the darkness, she could only hear her long and light breathing. The sound of breathing that she usually couldn't hear was exceptionally clear in the boundless silence. She could only see the flame on her fingertips. The rest was hazy, which made it even more terrifying. Realizing that her mood wasn't right, Emotienga closed her eyes and made a hand seal. The space between her eyebrows shone brightly, and she instantly entered the virtual sky world. Seeing the familiar bamboo house and the brook, her mood calmed down a bit. Sitting in the bamboo house, Emotienga couldn't help but shake her head. Sure enough, her mental state wasn't tempered enough. If that was the case, there would definitely be problems when she went through the inner demon during core formation. Fortunately, she came out to gain experience. Otherwise, even if her master was a nascent soul cultivator, he wouldn't be able to find any problems with her. She sat cross-legged and began to adjust her breath. She ran her great circulatory circle to confirm that her mood was calm before she prepared to go out and continue exploring. But before she could chant the incantation, she suddenly stopped. Outside the virtual sky world, a vague voice came. "Big brother Xiao, take a rest first." This was Shangruan's voice. Emotienga made a hand seal and pointed her finger. Then the voice became clear. "Big brother Xiao." Shangruan's breathing was very loud. She seemed very tired. With her cultivation level in the early stage of the foundation building realm, there was no reason for her to feel tired. Could it be that she was injured? After a while, she finally heard Yao Zixio's voice. "Little sister Wan, are you all right?" Shangruan panted for a while before her breathing gradually became smooth. She said, "Big brother Xiao, why are you in such a hurry?" Emotienga could hear the complaint in her voice. Yao Zixio said, "We survived a disaster and found a cultivator's immortal's cave here. There might be some treasures inside, so of course I'm in a hurry. If Daoist Fangzheng and that female cultivator surnamed Yi find them, won't we have a share?" "So what if we don't have a share?" Shangruan was a bit annoyed. "Didn't you say being with me would be good? If we can be together, so what if we don't have any treasures?" After a while, Yao Zixio finally said, "Little sister Wan, I'm doing this for the sake of us being together. We went through all kinds of hardships to escape. What if we get caught again? All these years I've thought it through. Without cultivation level and strength, we don't have the right to speak. Back then, if my cultivation level wasn't too low, your father wouldn't have promised you to someone else. If we weren't too weak, we wouldn't have had to hide from place to place all these years and run to the secular world. Little sister Wan, don't you understand? In the cultivation world, strength is the foundation of everything. Otherwise, it'd be hard for us to be together." "What's so hard about this?" Shangruan's voice was filled with anger. "If we find a place to live in seclusion, my father and the others won't be able to find us even if they want to die." As she said that, she once again softened. "Big brother Xiao, what's wrong with you? You weren't like this before. Why?" "Don't ask me why," Yao Zixio shouted. Emotienga was also startled by him. After thinking about it, she felt somewhat worried, so she tapped the space between her eyebrows. A bead emerged from there, and she cast an art on it. A crack appeared in the virtual sky world, and she saw the Yao couple in the stone path. Shang Ruan also seemed to be startled by Yao Zixio. She stared at him in astonishment. However, Yao Zixio's expression softened, and he said in a gentle voice, "Little sister Wan, I want to give you happiness, and not take you to hide from place to place. I want to bring you back openly one day, and let your father and the others know that your choice of me was right." Upon hearing what he said, Shang Ruan looked touched. "You don't have to be like this. I've already said it before. I don't care what your cultivation level is. It's enough as long as I can be with you." "No, little sister Wan," Yao Zixio insisted. I can't be that kind of cowardly man. If that's the case, everything your father said back then would be right. I only have 3 spiritual roots. Even building my foundation was very difficult for me. If you didn't secretly give me your foundation building pills, I don't even know if I could build my foundation. I want to prove to your father that although my aptitude isn't good, I can still build my foundation. After listening up to this point, Mo Tiange roughly understood what was going on with this Yao Zixio couple. These 2 people weren't individual cultivators whose clans had declined at all. They were cultivators who escaped from their clans. It was probably true that they were childhood sweethearts. After growing up together, they developed feelings for each other over time. However, Yao Zixio's aptitude was only average. He couldn't enter Shang Ruan's father's eyes, so he forbade the 2 of them from seeing each other. As a result, Shang Ruan secretly eloped with Yao Zixio. Perhaps there were some mistakes in the details, but that was most likely the case. However, Mo Tiange had a bad premonition when she heard what Yao Zixio said. Shang Ruan was in the middle of the situation, so she probably didn't notice Yao Zixio's hidden thoughts. He said he wanted to give her happiness, but his gaze was flickering in a place Shang Ruan couldn't see. She was afraid that this man was already unwilling to live a life that only had love. With a hint of a sneer on her face, Mo Tiange continued to listen to their conversation. Shang Ruan was finally convinced. She leaned against Yao Zixio's chest and said softly, "Big brother Xiao, don't worry. On our way here, we didn't find any traces left by other people. Presumably, we were the only ones who found them. I quite like that little sister from Yi clan, but I wonder if she's still alive. Rest assured, that girl's cultivation level is higher than ours. Even if the 2 of us joined hands, we probably wouldn't be able to defeat her. She also has a spiritual treasure, so she should be fine." "That's true," Yao Zixio said. "This fellow Taoist Yi, I really don't know her identity. How old do you think she is?" Shang Ruan thought for a moment, then answered, "Although this little sister's behavior is steady, I can tell she's still a little girl at first glance. I can't give a specific age, but she's most likely below 80 years old." "Below 80 years old?" Yao Zixio's gaze flickered as he muttered. "At this age, she's actually already in the peak of the middle stage of the foundation building realm. If she's lucky, she'll probably be able to form her gold core when she's 100 years old, right? She must be an elite disciple of a big cultivation group." "Most likely," Shang Ruan said. "Judging from the spiritual treasure she has, it's far superior to her peers, so she definitely can't be an individual cultivator. I'm afraid a small cultivation group wouldn't be able to nurture someone like that." Yao Zixio nodded inwardly. His gaze was contemplative. "If that's the case, it's actually a gain." "What?" Shang Ruan didn't hear him clearly. Yao Zixio promptly chuckled. "It's nothing. Little sister Wan, are you feeling better? Should we keep going?" Chapter 158. Once the Yao couple had gone far away, Mo Tiange pressed the space between her eyebrows and came out of the virtual sky world. She stared in the direction they left, lost in thought. Shang Ruan didn't see it, but she did. This Yao Zixio's gaze kept drifting. She was afraid he didn't mean what he said. When he mentioned her, his gaze had a different meaning. Although Shang Ruan was observant, she trusted her husband wholeheartedly, so she didn't notice anything. Alas, based on their conversation, they once had an unforgettable love. They even ran away from home and eloped in spite of other people's gazes. Who would have thought that such an unforeseen event would happen after their loving companionship? That Yao Zixio was obviously unwilling. How could cultivators completely give up on their cultivation? When they eloped, they might have been sincere. But after they obtained her, they weren't willing to be like this for the rest of their lives. So they still wanted to advance their cultivation levels. What about bringing her back openly? That was all a lie. He just wanted to obtain power. After thinking for a while, Mo Tiange shook her head. This was someone else's business. It wasn't her place to meddle. It was just unfortunate for Shang Ruan. Although her cultivation level was average, her mental state surpassed many cultivation group disciples. Based on their conversation, her aptitude probably wasn't bad either. If she cultivated diligently, she might be able to advance. Love. Wasn't Tianxiao like this back then? At first, the two of them were loving and sweet, but as time passed, Meng Sigui developed some habits. The originally lively and enthusiastic Tianxiao turned into a compromising person. This Shang Ruan was probably even more miserable. She abandoned everything to elope. If she lost everything in the end, wouldn't she lose everything? Her relatives would be gone, her clan would be gone, and her originally beautiful future would also be gone. It was no wonder second uncle said weakness and passion were the enemies of female cultivators. If this Shang Ruan wasn't bound by emotions, and had her clan to back her up, her cultivation level would probably be far higher than her current one. As Mo Tiange pondered this, she couldn't help but sigh. Although that Yao Zixio harbored malicious intentions towards her, it didn't prevent them from having the same goal. Sensing that the two of them had already walked quite a distance ahead, Mo Tiange simply released her divine sense to lock onto the two of them. She then concealed herself and followed their tracks. Just like that, Mo Tiange followed the Yao couple all the way down the stone path in the darkness. She was unexpectedly safe and sound. What made Mo Tiange vigilant was that after the Yao couple entered a stone door with her divine sense, she couldn't sense any traces of them anymore. Just as Mo Tiange was hesitating whether she should enter this obviously mysterious stone door, she suddenly sensed another person's breath. It was Taoist Fangzheng. Due to the incident with Yao Zixio, Mo Tiange naturally became even more vigilant. Once she sensed Taoist Fangzheng's aura, she immediately activated the virtual sky mirror and hid inside it. Huh! Taoist Fangzheng let out a cry of surprise, then vigilantly looked around for a while. He then quickly walked towards the stone door the Yao couple entered through. Similarly, after Taoist Fangzheng entered that stone door, his aura disappeared without a trace. Just as Mo Tiange was about to come out of the virtual sky mirror, she saw another group of 5 people entering the hall. Among the 5 people, 2 male cultivators were in the middle stage of the foundation building realm, while the remaining 3 female cultivators were in the early stage of the foundation building realm. It was unknown if the 2 male cultivators were together, but the 3 female cultivators were obviously disciples of the same sect. Perhaps because the formation outside was already broken, the 5 people who came in didn't look as disheveled as the 4 of them. Among the 5 people, the 2 male cultivators walked in the front, while the 3 female cultivators walked behind them. Mo Tiange decided to go in and give it a try. Since the formation outside was easy to break, if there was any danger inside, with the virtual sky mirror in hand, even if she couldn't obtain any benefits, she wouldn't lose her life. Besides, this time, she was going out to gain experience, so she couldn't be too careful. Otherwise, this experience would seem meaningless. After Mo Tiange came out of the virtual sky mirror, she also stepped through the door without any hesitation. Once Mo Tiange entered the stone door, she sensed a fluctuation of with spiritual aura coming from under her feet. Furthermore, the stone floor was moving at a constant speed. Mo Tiange's vision darkened for a moment before it brightened again. She discovered she was inside a domed hall, and under her feet was a circular stone platform floating in the air. Not far from her, there were 4 circular stone platforms floating in the air. One of them was occupied by the Yao couple, Taoist Fangzheng, the 2 male cultivators who came later, and the 3 female cultivators from the same sect. The 5 stone platforms were gold, cyan, blue, red and yellow respectively. They emitted pure spiritual aura of the 5 elements. Mo Tiange was standing on a cyan stone platform. When this stone platform, moved until it formed a pentagon with the other 4 stone platforms. It stopped. Shang Ruan, who was sitting on the red stone platform, looked fine now. Once she saw Emotienga standing still, she smiled and said to Emotienga, "Little sister, fortunately, you also came in without a hitch." Shang Ruan knew Yao Zixio harbored malicious intentions towards her. But Shang Ruan was completely unaware of it, and treated her so warmly. In contrast, Emotienga actually felt this woman was a bit kinder, so she returned a smile and said, "Thank you for your concern, big sister." Once Shang Ruan finished greeting her, she asked in a very natural manner, "What do you think of this hall?" Emotienga looked around then answered, "Big sister and the other fellow Taoists came in early. I wonder if you've discovered anything." With a smile, Shang Ruan pointed at the 2 male cultivators on the yellow stone platform and said, "Fellow Taoist Lu and fellow Taoist Wang said this thing is called a 5 elements platform, but they don't know how to activate it." Upon hearing what she said, Emotienga looked at the 2 male cultivators and asked, "Does this 5 elements platform belong to the category of magic tools or?" The slightly taller of the 2 male cultivators answered, 5 elements platforms first originated from Tianliang School on Mount Yuzhu in Kunhua mountain range. It has a history of several thousand years. Because Mount Yuzhu has a stone forest structure, the cultivators in that area all live on the stone pillars. The 5 elements platforms were originally built by them for the convenience of the disciples in their school, who had low cultivation levels and couldn't fly. However, according to the book, the reason why the 5 elements platforms are called 5 elements platforms is because each stone platform is evolved from a formation. Even if the 5 elements aren't controlled by humans, they can still fly according to a certain pattern on Mount Yuzhu. Although this stone platform's appearance and function are almost the same as the 5 elements platforms in the book, each of them clearly occupies one of the 5 elements. Furthermore, there's nothing else in this hall. It's really beyond what I've seen. The male cultivator standing next to him waited for him to finish speaking, then added, "Ordinary things can only be controlled by 3 kinds of things: divine comprehension, spiritual aura, and primordial blood. However, if you make a mistake, I don't know what will happen." Seeing that the 2 male cultivators were able to clearly understand the origins of things related to formations, it could be assumed that they were from a sect that specialized in formations. One of the 3 female cultivators from the same sect was the first to reveal a hint of fear. She looked at the stone door that hadn't been closed yet and softly said, "Senior Marshal Sister Yen, we don't know anything about formations, so it's hard for us to judge whether this is right or wrong. How about we leave first?" The other female cultivator frowned and agreed. Junior Marshal Sister Yen's words are reasonable. Besides, we still haven't finished the task Master gave us, so we shouldn't take any risks. Senior Marshal Sister Yen nodded and said, "Since that's the case, it's more important for us to get down to business." Unexpectedly, just as she finished speaking, the stone platform floated toward the stone door. The 3 of them cried out in surprise. When the stone platform floated to the door, the 3 of them glanced at each other. Senior Marshal Sister Yen said, "How about we think about it together and go back to where we were just now?" The 3 women reached an agreement, and the stone platform actually moved back to its original position. A hint of joy flashed across everyone's faces in the main hall. However, after feeling pleasantly surprised, everyone revealed bitter smiles again. Shang Ruan was the first to show a bitter smile. "Even if we know how to use it, we don't know where we're going." Unexpectedly, Shang Ruan's question, "Where we're going?" echoed in the main hall. A white light flashed before everyone's eyes, and they saw 5 large words floating in the middle of the main hall. Emotienga's position happened to be opposite to Shang Ruan's, so she could only see the 4 words in reverse. "This life eternal heaven." This life eternal heaven? Emotienga only had enough time to think of these words in her divine comprehension before she sensed the stone platform moving quickly. The other stone platforms also acted the same way as this one. They all started to spin rapidly with the center of the main hall as the center. The gales they experienced when they entered the valley were actually swirling upwards from the empty bottom of the main hall. Just as Emotienga was about to release her protective aura, she saw a circle of bright blue light erupting from the edge of the stone platform. Right after that, she felt there was nothing under her feet, so she subconsciously summoned the white silk handkerchief. By the time she regained her composure, she realized the main hall had disappeared, the 5 elements platforms had disappeared, and the person who was standing next to her a moment ago had also disappeared. She returned to that valley with green grass and bright sunlight. Under her feet was the white silk handkerchief she usually used to fly. The stone statue in the valley was still the same stone statue, but the entrance was no longer there. On the precipitous mountain wall she saw just now, there were now many stone platforms shaped like entrances. There were many 5 elements platforms flying in the valley, and each 5 elements platform was formed by 5 ring-shaped colors. The trees in the valley weren't as short as before. They were all towering trees, and there were also wooden bridges made of tree vines connecting the trees. Looking at this situation, not only did the spiritual aura in the valley have a bit more spiritual aura, but it also seemed a bit more human. Emotienga felt that perhaps in the next moment, a woman wearing a short jacket with a phoenix hairpin and a long skirt would walk out from the stone platform on the precipitous mountain wall. Just as Emotienga was thinking about this, a woman dressed like this really walked out from one of the stone platforms in the middle of the mountain wall. That woman stepped on a horsetail whisk and flew towards Emotienga at high speed. Emotienga was ready to take action, but the woman said, "Fellow Taoist, do you see the 2 junior martial sisters who came with me?" Emotienga took a closer look. Although her attire had completely changed, this woman was obviously the woman surnamed Yen from the main hall just now. However, under this attire, she looked even more graceful and charming. Emotienga said with astonishment, "Fellow Taoist Yen, why are you dressed like this?" A trace of astonishment flashed across the woman surnamed Yan's face. She said, "Miss, aren't you also dressed like me?" Emotienga was about to refute when she felt a chill on her shoulder. She looked down and saw that she, who was still wearing a loose robe with big sleeves, was now wearing a short jacket and a long skirt just like the woman surnamed Yen. However, the woman's attire was the same as the one on the stone platform. It was a brilliant gold color, while Emotienga's was a verdant green. Emotienga recalled that her attire only changed after the woman surnamed Yen arrived. So she asked, "Fellow Taoist Yen, did you change into this kind of attire right after you arrived here?" The woman surnamed Yen pondered for a moment then answered, "When I arrived here, I was separated from my 2 junior martial sisters. That doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like I only changed into this kind of attire after I walked onto the stone platform." Emotienga asked again, "Then when fellow Taoists saw me, was I already dressed like this?" The woman surnamed Yen wrinkled her brows and answered, "This? I'm not too sure." Emotienga's expression couldn't help but change. Divine comprehension could actually play such a big role in this place. After thinking for a moment, she understood what was going on. Obviously, after she saw the stone statue at the entrance, her divine comprehension flashed in her mind, and what she saw in front of her was the same as what she imagined. An illusory formation was also an illusory formation. More than 10 years ago, she and Wei Jiasi experienced an illusion during the demonic beast riot. However, compared to this illusion, that one was simply too crude. Emotienga once recalled that if she went to experience that illusion today, she would definitely be able to break it in the first round. However, the illusion in front of her was clearly fake, yet it looked flawless. Upon seeing Emotienga's expression suddenly change, the woman surnamed Yen furrowed her brows and asked, "Fellow Taoist, is there something wrong?" Emotienga slowly exhaled. While carefully observing her surroundings, she said, "Fellow Taoist, could it be that you haven't noticed that whatever we think about becomes real?" Just as this thought flashed through her mind, a spiritual beast that looked like Xiaohua suddenly appeared on the grass and pounced towards her. Emotienga reached out her hand and stroked the head of this Xiaohua. It was smooth to the touch, just like the real thing. Upon hearing what Emotienga said, the woman surnamed Yan's expression immediately changed. She pondered for a moment then made a hand seal, sending a wind blade towards Xiaohua. Unexpectedly, Xiaohua suddenly jumped and rolled away, spewing out an ardent yang real fire. Ah! The woman surnamed Yin hastily dodged, but she still shouted at Mo Tiange. Fellow Taoist, isn't this real? Mo Tiange shook her hand, and the shuttle of flying Apsara turned into a golden light that surrounded Xiaohua. She then used the soul-refining art and fiercely pressed it down. The second-rank spiritual beast Xiaohua immediately let out a whimper and fell to the ground. She stared at Xiaohua's corpse and said slowly, "This is fake." The woman surnamed Yin stared at her in a daze. Just now she personally tested it. This spiritual beast was indeed a second-rank spiritual beast. But when Mo Tiange attacked, this spiritual beast didn't even have the chance to resist and was killed. Why is it fake? Although it wasn't the real Xiaohua, Mo Tiange still frowned. She turned her head away from the badly mutilated corpse of the spiritual beast and explained to the woman, "I didn't bring any spiritual beasts with me on this trip. I was just testing it." Sure enough, as soon as I thought of spiritual beasts, it transformed into my spiritual beast's appearance. Moreover, even its cultivation level was the same. There was only one flaw. When Xiaohua advanced to the second rank, his ardent yang real fire turned into sun real fire. So this fake Xiaohua had the appearance of a real second-rank inferno beast. Upon realizing this, Mo Tiange's brows furrowed again. To be able to do this, it showed that the master of this illusory formation used his own thoughts to set up the formation. However, this also showed a deeper problem. The master of this illusory formation had very profound knowledge. He seemed to be able to transform whatever the person who entered the formation thought of. This point was even more terrifying than the power of the illusory formation itself. The existence of an illusory formation proved that the master's attainments in formations were very high. However, all formations could be cracked. Nevertheless, with his knowledge, this illusory formation had no flaws at all. Moreover, from another perspective, what kind of person could have such profound knowledge? He could actually imitate the things most people thought of without the slightest error, except for some mutated things. This was too terrifying. The more Mo Tiange thought about it, the more she felt that the master of this illusory formation had abilities beyond her imagination. In the end, her forehead was already covered in fine beads of sweat. Although the woman surnamed Yin heard Mo Tiange's explanation, she didn't understand why Mo Tiange had such a reaction and was full of doubts. However, the fact that Mo Tiange easily killed a second-rank spiritual beast just now made her realize that Mo Tiange's strength was a bit higher than that of ordinary middle-stage foundation-building cultivators. She couldn't help but feel a hint of reverence towards Mo Tiange. Little sister Yin Ruoshu from Bishuan Court. May I ask big sister's name and which group you're from? At first, she only called Mo Tiange Miss or fellow Taoist, but now she called her little sister and called her big sister on purpose. Mo Tiange just said faintly, "I'm Yi Xiaotian. My master is nameless. Presumably, fellow Taoist also doesn't know me." Mo Tiange's indifferent tone and her unwillingness to say her master's name made the woman named Yin Ruoshu rather angry. However, when she thought about the current situation, Mo Tiange's expression remained calm, so she swallowed her anger. "Big sister Yi, what's going on? It should be an illusory formation." Mo Tiange lowered her head to look at herself. She closed her eyes to think. When she opened her eyes again, sure enough, her clothes had returned to their original appearance. Illusory array? Yin Ruoshu turned her head to take a look. The flowers, the trees, the spirit beasts, and the birds were all real. She couldn't help but feel afraid. What should we do? There's nothing I can do for now. Mo Tiange took out the white silk handkerchief and the shuttle of flying Apsara and prepared herself to face the enemy. She then turned her head and said, "Let's go. We'll look for other people first. If we can find them, we'll think about our next step." All right. Yin Ruoshu had no choice but to nod her head helplessly. After walking for a while, Yin Ruoshu asked, "Big sister Yi, did you also come here to work in the secular world?" While walking, Mo Tiange attentively observed her surroundings. When she heard Yin Ruoshu's voice, she hastily answered. Yin Ruoshu continued, "That's truly a coincidence. We 3 senior sisters and junior sisters were ordered by Master to come to the mortal world to handle some matters. And we just happened to notice spirit energy escaping from here. So we came over to take a look. Sister Yi, what do you want to do? If it's a coincidence, can you come with us? This woman was indeed a bit noisy. Mo Tiange wrinkled her brows and said, I left the mountain to travel under my master's orders, so I'm not sure where I'm going. Then how about Sister Yi come with us? We are both women, so we must have a lot of common topics. Big Sister Yi. Mo Tiange frowned inwardly as this woman kept talking about Bishuan Court. Mo Tiange knew what kind of cultivation group Yan Ruoshu was talking about was Bishuan Court. Reportedly, this cultivation group only accepted women. It was built in an extremely secretive place, and rarely had any contact with the outside world. It was a relatively mysterious cultivation group. The power of this cultivation group wasn't big nor small. Its scale was roughly the same as Yunwu sect or Zixia sect in the past. However, this Yan Ruoshu was very indifferent towards Mo Tiange before. But now, she was a lot more enthusiastic. Obviously, she was alone in this place. Seeing that Mo Tiange's cultivation level was higher than hers, she wanted to befriend Mo Tiange. In fact, they were alone now. Mo Tiange never had the habit of leaving her companions behind, so if there was any danger, Mo Tiange would naturally protect her. This Yan Ruoshu basically didn't need to be like this. Fellow Taoist Yan, do you have a way to contact your 2 junior martial sisters? Mo Tiange interrupted Yan Ruoshu. Yan Ruoshu paused for a moment then nodded. We have a sect summoning talisman. The so-called sect summoning talisman was a method for disciples of the same cultivation group to communicate with each other. This talisman was different from a personal summoning talisman. It used a special method. Once it was sent out, all the disciples of the same cultivation group within a certain range would receive it. Mo Tiange also had several sect summoning talismans in her hands. Every disciple of a cultivation group could receive them when they left the mountain. However, it wasn't easy to make these talismans, so it was best not to use them unless it was an emergency. Upon hearing what Yan Ruoshu said, Mo Tiange said, in that case, fellow Taoist Yan, you should try to use the sect summoning talisman. It's really hard to find people blindly like this. Chapter 159. Yan Ruoshu sent a summoning talisman to the group. The talisman flew into the air, circled once, then fell back into Yan Ruoshu's hand. Yan Ruoshu was at a loss. Mo Tiange frowned and said, forget it. It seems even summoning talismans don't work in this illusory formation. Since it was an illusory formation, it naturally had its limitations. What should she do now? If the whole valley was an illusory formation, where was the exit? This valley was surrounded by cliffs, but the sky. Mo Tiange raised her head to look at the sky but still shook her head. Even if foundation building cultivators could fly, the sky was probably within the range of the illusory formation. The 2 of them circled the valley, but didn't find anyone else. So they returned to the stone statue and sat on the altar. Yan Ruoshu saw that Mo Tiange was still calm despite being surrounded, so she unconsciously relied on her. In order to relieve her tension, she kept talking to Mo Tiange. As it turned out, the 3 female cultivators from Bishuan Court came here together with her, but they fell behind because she sped up. About an hour after Mo Tiange and Taoist Fangjing entered the valley, Yan Ruoshu's group of 5 also met the 2 male cultivators surnamed Lu and Wang on the cliff. They were also cultivators from the same group. They learned from the aura refining cultivators on the cliff that there were already 4 foundation building cultivators going down the valley together. They also learned that there were gales, miasma, and other things in the valley, so the 5 of them went down together. Unlike Mo Tiange's group, these 5 people laid a formation to resist the gales according to the instructions of the 2 male cultivators. However, how could this kind of formation, which was laid according to position, compare to Mo Tiange's white silk handkerchief? They only went about 300 meters down, but they already felt it was difficult to resist. At that moment, for some reason, the gales suddenly weakened, so they could go down the valley smoothly. As soon as they entered the valley, they discovered that it was completely different from the dangerous gales and miasma high up in the sky. It was quiet and beautiful like a paradise. After searching for a while, they finally found this stone statue. When Emotinga heard this, she roughly understood what happened. After they were swept down by the gales, she didn't lose consciousness for long. Later, they found the stone statue and broke the formation. So the gales weakened, and the 5 of them were able to reach the bottom of the valley smoothly. After understanding what happened, Emotinga felt even more puzzled. After thousands of years, the formation had long since lost its original might, which was why she was able to break it so easily. However, she had never imagined that the formation could actually affect the astral winds in the valley. If that was the case, wouldn't the might of the formation be much stronger than she had imagined? The hidden little spirit vein, the formation of the altar, the mysterious 5 elements platform, and this illusory formation that he knew was fake, but couldn't see through. The master of this place was really terrifying. In addition, this valley was clearly as beautiful as a fairyland, but the air was filled with miasma and astral winds, as if it was deliberately not letting outsiders know. Putting all these together, it sounded like some kind of expert was living here in seclusion. However, what about the stone statue and the altar? The two appeared in the same place, which was like worshipping gods in the mortal world, but there were traces of immortal cultivators everywhere. Could it be that there were mortals in this valley who worshipped the immortal cultivators who lived here as gods? She thought of several possibilities in her mind, but Yen Ruashu was still jabbering on and on. Emotinga was annoyed by her, so she stood up and said, "Fellow Taoist Yen." Yen Ruashu was stunned. "Let's split up and search. If we run into other people, we'll meet here." Yen Ruashu was at a loss. She was indeed a bit scared to be alone. Emotinga's heart softened when she saw a trace of fear flashing across her face, but also embarrassed to say it out loud. She found this person too weak and displeasing to the eye, but she was actually just a timid woman who didn't have any bad intentions. Emotinga softened her tone and said, "If it's inconvenient for fellow Taoist, you can wait for me here. I'll be back soon." Yen Ruashu nodded gratefully. "Okay, big sister Yi, you have to be careful." Emotinga gave her a smile, then she controlled the white silk handkerchief and flew up. When she was with Yen Ruashu just now, they only roughly searched the entire valley. This time, without Yen Ruashu chattering on the side, Emotinga carefully searched the stone platforms one by one. The location of the stone statue in the T-shaped valley happened to be in the bottommost hook. There was also a long valley path that was horizontal and vertical. There were too many trees and their branches were too lush, making it inconvenient to fly. Emotinga simply got off the white silk handkerchief and walked along the vine bridge. If she ran into a 5 elements platform, she would be directly taken to the next point. Maybe those people also did the same. She might be able to find 1 or 2 by chance this way. As she walked on the vine bridge and among the trees, she heard the chirping of insects, the singing of birds, and the frolicking of spiritual beasts. Emotinga suddenly had a feeling that living in seclusion for the rest of her life, in such a paradise, was also good. But this thought only flashed in her mind for a moment, before she immediately swept it out of her mind. She had a virtual sky world. Wasn't it also a paradise inside? What was there to be envious about? If she let this thought go, she was afraid she really wouldn't be able to get out of this illusory formation for the rest of her life. After walking for a while, she suddenly sensed a faint spiritual aura fluctuation with her divine sense. Emotinga's spirit was aroused. She couldn't care about anything else. She alternated between the vine bridge and the 5 elements platforms, rushing towards the spiritual aura fluctuation. The spiritual aura fluctuation became clearer and clearer. She clearly felt that 3 cultivators were fighting. One of them had a somewhat familiar spiritual aura. Emotinga stepped onto another 5 elements platform. She turned a corner and saw it. It was the 2 male cultivators Lu and Wang and Taoist Fangjing. She didn't know what was going on, but the 3 of them were actually fighting recklessly with bloodshot eyes. The other strange thing was that although the 2 male cultivators Lu and Wang were fighting together against Taoist Fangjing, they would trip each other up from time to time. It was simply a three-way fight. If she only met them on the road, Emotienga wouldn't have paid any attention to them. Even if the three of them died together, it wouldn't have mattered to her. But now, they encountered the illusory formation in this valley together, and each of them was standing on one of the 5 colored stone platforms. Who knew if something bad would happen if one of them died? With that thought in mind, Emotienga summoned the white silk handkerchief. As she flew towards them, she shouted, "Stop!" The 3 people looked at her at the same time, but all of them suddenly changed direction and started to attack her with magic tools and spells. Taoist Fangjing shouted, "Fellow Taoisti, don't get involved. I found this thing first." Emotienga was stunned. She didn't have time to think about the meaning of his words, because the attacks from the 3 people's magic tools had already arrived. She raised her hand, causing a brick wall to fall, and completely blocked the 3 people's attacks. At the same time, she used the shuttle of flying Apsara and the soul refining art to release its spiritual aura pressure. The 3 people immediately felt their heads go numb, and their movements were a step slower. Each of them was surrounded by the golden rays formed by the shuttle of flying Apsara. Nevertheless, these 3 people weren't mediocre. Among the 9 people trapped in this valley, 5 of them were in the early stage of the foundation building realm, while the 4 of them were in the middle stage of the foundation building realm. Emotienga wasn't afraid of facing 3 middle stage foundation building cultivators at the same time. But even if she wasn't afraid, it was still very difficult for her. She borrowed the spiritual aura pressure from the second layer of the soul refining art to seize the initiative and split the shuttle of flying Apsara into 3, trapping the 3 people at the same time. In the next moment, the 3 of them reacted, and each used their own methods. Taoist Fangjing used a horsetail whisk. Although it wasn't a high-grade magic tool, it had a lot of experience. Among the 2 male cultivators surnamed Lu and Wang, one used a sword while the other was a talisman cultivator. When the 3 of them attacked her at the same time, even though Emotienga's magic tool was powerful, she still found herself in danger. At that moment, the benefits of comparing notes with Yi Jingwen all day long previously showed themselves. Yi Jingwen was a sword cultivator, and his fighting techniques were also superior to cultivators in the same realm as him. He had a move called 1,000 Directions Broken Light Sword, which was extremely powerful. When he released several hundred sword auras to attack the enemy at the same time, it was no different from fighting several cultivators at the same time. Now that she saw the 3 people attacking her at the same time, Emotienga, who had already prepared her soul refining art, instantly released her spiritual aura pressure. The shuttle of flying Apsara closed, and she once again attacked the talisman cultivator surnamed Wang. At the same time, she also summoned the enchanting lantern and firmly blocked their attacks with the white silk handkerchief. Several methods were launched at the same time, and there were practically no pauses in between. This was the result of comparing notes with Yi Jingwen. The faster she attacked, and the more methods she had, the higher her chances of winning were. The enchanting lantern shone brightly, the shuttle of flying Apsara laid a formation, and the soul refining art suppressed them. For a moment, the 3 people were suppressed by her, and stopped for a moment. Emotienga shouted, "Wake up! This is an illusory formation." Right after she said that, and their divine senses were suppressed by the soul refining art, the 3 people were stunned for a moment, before they somewhat sobered up. Emotienga seized this opportunity and shouted, "Whatever you think will appear here. You mustn't fall into the trap." The 3 people finally stopped. Taoist Fangjing's expression was filled with doubt. "It's fake." Emotienga heaved a sigh of relief. "Correct. What did you see just now? Each of you should think about something else." The 3 people were skeptical, so they turned around to look behind them. Only then did Emotienga notice that there was a snow-white flower growing on the rock wall. It was surrounded by immortal aura, and it looked like a fairy descending to the world. She suddenly understood. This was the white jade snow lotus, a rare species passed down from the distant past era. It could be concocted into a kind of medicinal pill called Heavenly Fragrance Pill. This pill could help people break through bottlenecks, and it was also effective for nascent soul cultivators. It was no wonder the 3 of them fought over it. However, there were several stalks in her virtual sky world, and they were much older than this one. So there was no need for her to be jealous. In fact, the three people had been observing her. If she saw this thing and was tempted, they would kill her immediately. However, when Emotinga saw the white jade snow lotus, she only showed a look of realization on her face before she regained her calmness. Only then did the three of them listen to her and try to think about other things. All of a sudden, the white jade snow lotus turned into green smoke and disappeared into the air. What appeared in that place was a spiritual plant enshrouded in purple aura. It swayed in the wind and was surrounded by spiritual aura. Purple slewgrass. The three people's expressions changed greatly. They looked at each other and remained silent. Emotinga knew they believed her, so she heaved a sigh of relief. She put away her magic weapons and tools, then walked towards them. You saw it. In here, whatever you think in your heart will directly appear in front of you. Spiritual plants and exotic flowers? They're all fake. Taoist Fangjing's face alternated between red and white. In the end, he heaved a long sigh and said, "It seems I was too impatient. In that case, I have to thank the master of this place. If it weren't for this illusory formation, I also wouldn't have realized I almost had an inner demon." Based on what he said, it seemed the person who imagined the white jade snow lotus here was Taoist Fangjing. But of course, he wasn't young, and he didn't have a cultivation group to rely on, so he must be the most anxious. Medicinal pills concocted from white jade snow lotus could help people break through bottlenecks, so it must be what he needed the most right now. Therefore, as soon as he arrived here, he hoped to find this kind of miraculous medicine. When the two cultivators Lu and Wang heard what Taoist Fangjing said, they also looked ashamed. Not only did they believe her, but they also had a falling out with their fellow disciples because of it. Even if the two of them didn't mention it, there was already a grudge in their hearts. Taoist Fangjing cupped his hands towards Emotinga, then said sincerely, "Fellow Taoist Yi, thank you very much for this time." Emotinga nodded to accept his bow, then asked, "Fellow Taoist Fangjing, fellow Taoist Lu, fellow Taoist Wang, how did you get here?" The one who answered was still Taoist Fangjing. "After I disappeared from the 5 Elements platforms, I found myself not too far from here. I slowly walked here until I found the white jade snow lotus. Just as I was about to pick it, these two fellow Taoists rushed out." He cast a glance at the two cultivators Lu and Wang. Although he maintained his politeness, there was a hint of disdain in his gaze. Obviously, when the two cultivators Lu and Wang saw the lotus, they also wanted to take it for themselves, and had a falling out with their fellow disciples. Emotinga wasn't interested in investigating this. She swept her gaze over the two cultivators Lu and Wang, then asked, "Have you seen anyone else?" The three of them shook their heads. Taoist Fangjing asked, "Then what about fellow Taoist Yi? What did you experience on this trip?" Emotinga said, "I was transported to the stone statue and I met fellow Taoist Yen. But fellow Taoist Yen was separated from her 2 junior martial sisters. And I also didn't see fellow Taoist Yao and his wife." "Then how did fellow Taoist Yi know this place was an illusory formation? Could it be that you also encountered something?" It was the cultivator surnamed Lu who interrupted. There was a suspicious look in his eyes. Obviously, he thought they also encountered something similar. Emotinga said faintly, "When fellow Taoist Yen and I met, and discovered we were wearing the same clothes from that stone statue, I knew something was amiss. Sure enough, when I tried, I confirmed this place was undoubtedly an illusory formation." Oh, this answer surprised the two cultivators Lu and Wang, but since they saw her methods just now, they didn't dare to say anything. This little girl looked gentle, but her attacks were really terrifying. Her movements were as fast as wind and thunder, and her magic weapon was powerful. Although she was also in the middle stage of the foundation building realm like them, she dared to fight against the three of them alone, without showing any signs of losing. They originally thought they were cultivators from cultivation groups, so they looked down on this group of cultivators from the secular world. They thought this female cultivator was an individual cultivator, like the Yao couple and Taoist Fangjing. They never expected her to be so powerful. Right now, They were certain Emotienga was undoubtedly a cultivator from a cultivation group. Fellow Taoist Yi, what should we do now? The three of them almost killed each other. Fortunately, Emotienga reminded them. So Taoist Fangjing was now very polite. Emotienga thought for a while then said, "We'd better find the others first. We're each standing on one of the 5 elements platforms. We don't know what will happen to the others if they don't pass the test. If something happens to them, and we get implicated because of it, things won't be good." The three of them thought about it and agreed. They each stood on one of the 5 elements platforms, so they might have already been recognized as one. What if one of them didn't pass the illusory formation, and this formation turned into a killing formation? If they lost their lives just like that, it would be too unjust. Fellow Taoist Yi is right. Taoist Fangjing was the first to agree. Lu and Wang looked at each other and nodded. Shall we go look for them first? Let's split up and search. Emotienga said. It'll be faster to find them this way. Fellow Taoist Yen and I agreed to meet at the stone statue. After we find them, we'll go to the stone statue. Just in case. How about we split into groups of 2? It's easy to fall into the trap if you're alone. So it's good to have someone on the side to remind you, Taoist Fangjing suggested. Lu and Wang hesitated for a moment, but didn't say anything. They had just fought, and it was obvious that there was a grudge between them. However, in this unfamiliar environment, they could still trust each other a little. That's settled then. Emotienga spoke first. Fellow Taoist Lu, fellow Taoist Wang. You two are fellow apprentices, so you'll naturally be together. How about I go with fellow Taoist Fangjing? How could Lu and Wang not agree? They nodded, and the 4 of them split into groups of 2. Emotienga felt a bit more relaxed now that she was searching with Taoist Fangjing. Taoist Fangjing was an old cultivator who had been in the cultivation world for a long time. He wasn't a chatterbox like Yen Ruoshu, and he was even more experienced than her in handling matters. The 2 of them quickly searched their way. The place where Taoist Fangjing and the 2 cultivators Lu and Wang fought was at the T-shaped intersection. Since Emotienga came from the stone statue, they were divided into 2 teams, so they naturally went in opposite directions and searched for the 2 sides of the T-shaped intersection. Fellow Taoist Yi, Taoist Fangjing suddenly shouted from the stone platform on the other side. Emotienga turned around and saw Taoist Fangjing, who was on the other 5 elements platform, waving at her then pointing in a direction. She closed her eyes and released her divine sense. Sure enough, she found subtle spiritual aura fluctuations. She couldn't help but admire Taoist Fangjing's divine sense. Before entering the valley, she already knew he must have practiced a spell to strengthen his divine sense, but she didn't expect it to be so strong. She overlooked it, but Taoist Fangjing sensed it. Apparently, the saying "old ginger is spicier" was indeed true. Even though his cultivation level was a bit lower than hers, this Taoist Fangjing really couldn't be underestimated. The 2 of them chased after him, using the spiritual aura fluctuations. Before long, they heard fighting noises. It was Yen Ruoshu's 2 junior martial sisters. Emotienga was rather flabbergasted. It wasn't a big deal when it came to the 2 cultivators Lu and Wang. Male cultivators valued worldly possessions, and their characters were also more aggressive. When they came across treasures, it was very likely that they would fight each other, even if they were from the same cultivation group. However, these 2 were female cultivators. Female cultivators rarely fought each other when they ran into trouble, not to mention they were martial sisters from the same cultivation group. Taoist Fangjing was also astonished. The 2 of them slowly flew over. Sure enough, the 2 female cultivators from Bishuan Court were fighting each other. Moreover, judging from the way they fought, they didn't seem to be holding back at all. *TCH. In the middle of the fight, one of the female cultivators dressed in black shouted loudly, "You still dare to attack me?" The other female cultivator dressed in yellow, whom Emotienga remembered was called Junior Martial Sister Yin, by the female cultivator dressed in black, withdrew her jade bracelet magic tool then uttered a cold humph. Senior Martial Sister Lu. It was you who attacked first. You. The female cultivator called Senior Marshal Sister Lu had a twisted expression, and her face was filled with resentment. Fellow Taoist Yi. Taoist Fangjing stopped and said softly, "Look over there." Mo Tiange looked in the direction Taoist Fangjing was pointing. Not far from the two female cultivators stood a white-robed man. He was very handsome, elegant and suave. Mo Tiange sensed spiritual aura fluctuations coming from his body. His cultivation level was in the early stage of the foundation-building realm. She muttered to herself, "This isn't a real person, right?" Taoist Fangjing frowned then slowly shook his head. "In my opinion, he shouldn't be." Mo Tiange already knew second-rank spiritual beasts could be created inside this illusory formation. So presumably, creating an early-stage foundation-building cultivator shouldn't be a problem, right? Since this person appeared where the two women were fighting, he was most likely the reason for their conflict. Alas, it's another emotional entanglement. For female cultivators, feelings were indeed more important than treasures. At that moment, Junior Marshal Sister Yun leaned towards the white-robed male cultivator and said in a sweet voice, "Big Brother Tang, look at Senior Marshal Sister Lu." Before she could finish, Senior Marshal Sister Lu whipped her magic tool whip and said angrily, "Yun Hanyan, don't go too far. Pretending to be weak and pitiful. What else can you do besides this trick? You're slandering me for hitting you. It's obviously you who insulted me, so I—" The woman called Yun Hanyan only glanced at her then turned to talk to the male cultivator again. "Big Brother Tang, I'm not that kind of person. You know Yun Hanyan." Senior Marshal Sister Lu couldn't help but shout angrily when she heard Yun Hanyan wiping her tears again. She didn't say anything else and lashed her whip again. The two women started fighting again. Mo Tiange couldn't help but rub the space between her eyebrows. Didn't these two people realize something was wrong with their Big Brother Tang? They were jealous of this man, but they couldn't even tell whether he was real or fake. Spiritual beasts and the like could be imitated, but humans were too complicated. Even if they could be imitated, the details would always be different. Since they were lovers, they would naturally be able to tell the difference. Taoist Fangjing flew towards them and shouted loudly, "Fellow Taoists!" His arrival finally made the two women stop fighting for a moment, but they still glared at each other with hatred and only paid a little attention to Taoist Fangjing. In the end, Senior Marshal Sister Lu still remembered the matter at hand. She asked, "Fellow Taoist, is something the matter?" Taoist Fangjing was annoyed that these two people didn't know what was important. Without saying a word, he raised his hand and threw his magic tool towards the white-robed male cultivator. The two women turned pale with fright. The two people who were fighting just now attacked Taoist Fangjing together. At that moment, Mo Tiange arrived. She waved her white silk handkerchief, blocking the two women's magic tools, allowing Taoist Fangjing to attack the white-robed male cultivator smoothly. Under Taoist Fangjing's attack, the white-robed male cultivator retreated all of a sudden. He then took out a flying sword and attacked Taoist Fangjing. Taoist Fangjing never expected that a fake illusion would be able to retreat and counterattack. He was stunned for a moment, and his reaction was a step too slow. The flying sword brushed past him and cut half of his sleeve. Taoist Fangjing was astonished as he held the half of his sleeve. Mo Tiange shouted, "Fellow Taoist Fangjing, that illusion has the strength of a real person. You must be careful." Taoist Fangjing regained his senses and immediately dodged to the side. He then raised his hand and used magic to fight with the white-robed male cultivator. Under normal circumstances, individual cultivators couldn't compare to cultivators from cultivation groups or cultivation clans because they lacked magic tools, spiritual talismans, spirit stones, and the like. They also didn't have good cultivation techniques, so they were at a disadvantage in fights of magical power. However, outstanding individual cultivators weren't inferior to cultivators from cultivation groups. Because their path to immortality was extremely difficult, they had perseverance and patience that surpassed ordinary people, and they were battle-hardened. Those who could reach the end and stand above everyone else were people with excellent wisdom and tyrannical spells. Although Taoist Fangjing couldn't be said to have excellent wisdom, he had roamed the cultivation world for several hundred years. Being able to reach the middle stage of the foundation-building realm and still live well proved that he surpassed other people in certain aspects. The fact that he could hold on for such a long time while fighting against Lu and Wang proved that he had some clues. This white-robed male cultivator was only in the early stage of the foundation-building realm, so his cultivation level was slightly lower than Taoist Fangjing's. Furthermore, he was an illusion. Although the illusory formation made him look like a real person, he lacked the flexibility and versatility of a real person in fights of magical power. Once he was tangled with Taoist Fangjing, it only took him a moment to show signs of defeat. Yun Hanyin and senior martial sister Lu were on tenterhooks when they saw Big Brother Tang in danger again and again. However, they were blocked by Mo Tiange and couldn't go forward, so the two of them were furious. They glanced at each other then simultaneously attacked Mo Tiange. When Mo Tiange saw that one of them took out several magic tools, and the other threw out a large number of talismans, looking as if they wanted to fight her to the death, she was also annoyed. She wanted to teach them a lesson, so she didn't show any mercy. The shuttle of flying Apsara and the white silk handkerchief both attacked and defended, resolving this move. In a flash, Mo Tiange released the spiritual aura pressure of the soul refining art, causing the two women to freeze. Mo Tiange didn't show any mercy. The golden rays from the shuttle of flying Apsara split into 2, and then 4. Each ray attacked the two women separately. The golden rays were aggressive, and their momentum was monstrous. Coupled with the fact that Mo Tiange was suppressing them with the spiritual aura pressure of the soul refining art, the two women no longer had the strength to fight back. They could only watch helplessly as the golden rays pierced their bodies. Ah! 2 cries of alarm rang out at the same time. Mo Tiange put away her magic weapons and magic tools then landed on the ground. She stared coldly at the two women. Ah! Also came from the other side. Taoist Fangjing had killed the illusion of the white-robed male cultivator. When the two women heard that sound, they simultaneously turned their heads and shouted, "Big Brother Tang!" Regardless of their injuries, they crawled up and staggered towards the white-robed male cultivator. They threw themselves on his body. Once they saw that he was no longer breathing, they burst into tears. Mo Tiange and Taoist Fangjing glanced at each other. Both of them frowned. Taoist Fangjing was used to worldly affairs, so he couldn't stand this kind of ignorant cultivation group disciples. Mo Tiange was also unhappy that the two women still hadn't realized something was wrong. After crying, senior martial sister Lu crawled up with a tear-stained face. A ruthless expression appeared on her face. "I'll fight you to the death." Mo Tiange was furious. She let out a cold humph, then raised her hand and pressed down. The golden rays she held back just now burst out of their bodies. Ah! The two women cried out and fell to the ground. Their shoulders were injured. "Why don't you think about why your big brother Tang is here?" Mo Tiange shouted. "You can't even distinguish an illusion. If I knew this would happen, I would have let you kill each other." The two women were stunned to hear what she said. Their tears hadn't dried yet as they stared at her blankly. "Illusion?" Senior martial sister Lu asked in a hoarse voice. Mo Tiange was very angry. She turned her head away, not wanting to talk to them. Taoist Fangjing could only step forward and explain. "Fellow Taoists, think carefully. How did your senior martial brother come here?" The two women were stunned. They glanced at each other, then Yun Hanyan said with uncertainty, Senior martial sister Lu and I walked here. While we were talking, we saw Big Brother Tang walking towards us." "Then how did you talk to your Big Brother Tang?" The two women were silent. After a while, senior martial sister Lu finally answered. "We quarreled as soon as we saw Big Brother Tang." "So that's what happened." These two women, Taoist Fangjing also couldn't bear it anymore. He furrowed his brows and continued to say, "Calm down and think about it. You've been fighting like this. Would your Big Brother Tang say nothing?" The two women were silent at the same time. The mournful expressions on their faces finally disappeared, because they quarreled as soon as they saw Big Brother Tang. They didn't have time to recall how Big Brother Tang should react. Therefore, this illusion didn't say anything, and only stood there in a daze. The hateful thing was, these two women still couldn't tell it apart. Enough, Emotinga said coldly. Wipe your tears, treat your wounds, and follow us. Chapter 160. Yin and Lu weren't seriously injured. Seeing how Emotinga and Taoist Fangjing spoke to them harshly and didn't conceal their disgust, they didn't dare to say anything. After all, it was a fact that their cultivation levels were higher than theirs. Moreover, they just witnessed their fighting strength. They were both female cultivators who weren't good at fights of magical powers. If they fought, any one of them would be enough to kill them. At that moment, the two of them obediently bandaged their wounds and left with Emotinga and Taoist Fangjing without saying a word. Although Emotinga wanted to teach them a lesson, she didn't hurt their vital parts. After casting a simple healing spell, Yin and Lu's injuries weren't serious. After watching such a farce, the group of four silently searched the rest of the way. As expected, they didn't find anything, so they rushed back to the stone statue. They walked to the bottom of the valley and turned a corner. The stone statue was right in front of them, but Emotinga was stunned. The altar was empty, and there was no one around it. Yin Ruashu wasn't there. Emotinga was powerless now. Although she didn't deny that female cultivators generally had lower fighting strength than male cultivators because of their personalities, most of the female cultivators she'd met weren't inferior to male cultivators. Aside from Lord Taoist Jinghe's maids with high standards, Yunwu Sec's Wang Qianyi and Morong Yen, Xianqing School's Luo Fingxue, Han Qingyu, and the others all had methods and temperaments that weren't inferior to male cultivators, so they never dragged others down. The three Bishuan court female cultivators she ran into really annoyed her. One was cowardly, and the other two were jealous. Could it be that there were only female cultivators in the group, and no male cultivators to compare them with? So they just let themselves be and didn't strive to improve themselves? Emotinga's expression darkened. I told fellow Taoist Yin we'd meet here, but I don't know where she went. Taoist Fangjing's expression also darkened. He was an individual cultivator, so he became even more furious when he saw how useless the group's disciples were. How much effort, and how many hardships did individual cultivators have to go through to reach the foundation-building realm? These groups' disciples had masters to teach them, and were worshipped by the group, yet they were actually so disappointing. Let's just wait here. If we get separated again it'll be troublesome, Taoist Fangjing said. We can't keep searching like this. If we lose someone else. After Taoist Fangjing said that, he didn't continue speaking. Emotinga already understood what he meant. They weren't these women's masters or relatives, so she couldn't take care of them right now. It would be better to just let them fend for themselves. Although this meaning was cruel, it was also the reality. If she had the strength to spare, Emotinga wouldn't mind lending a helping hand. However, she also couldn't make heads or tails of this illusory formation in front of her. It would be best if she didn't get killed by them. As an individual cultivator, Taoist Fangjing was able to smoothly live until he reached the middle stage of the foundation-building realm. When he needed to be ruthless, he would never be soft-hearted. Now that he saw that Emotinga was silent, he knew she had acquiesced, so his worried heart relaxed a little. Taoist Fangjing already saw Emotinga's strength during the fight just now. If he wanted to leave this place alive, he naturally hoped he could join hands with her. At that moment, however, the two cultivators Yin and Lu couldn't hear anything. Seeing their ignorant expressions, Emotinga felt pity and hatred in her heart. She steeled her heart and pretended she didn't see anything. Although she had the virtual sky world, they were now inside someone else's illusory formation. Even if they entered the virtual sky world, they would still be frustrated if they couldn't leave. Therefore, the most important thing right now was to leave this illusory formation safely. She didn't need to be responsible for other people's lives. The four of them waited on the stone statue altar for a while. The two cultivators Lu and Wang finally came back. When Emotinga sensed them with her divine sense, she deliberately paid attention to them. She realized there were only the two of them, and there was no trace of Yao Zixio or Shang Ruan. She felt both lucky and disappointed. She was lucky that the two of them came back safely. She was disappointed because she had a good impression of Shang Ruan, so she couldn't help but feel sad if Shang Ruan disappeared just like that. The two cultivators Lu and Wang arrived. They glanced around then asked, "What about the Yao couple and Miss Yan?" Daoist Fangjing fought with the two of them, so he didn't want to pay attention to them right now. Mo Tiange answered, "We also didn't find the Yao couple. Fellow Daoist Yin was originally here, but she disappeared when we came back. We don't know where she went." The two cultivators Lu and Wang glanced at each other and said anxiously, "Then what should we do? If something happened to them, will we also be implicated?" "I don't know," Mo Tiange said faintly. "We've searched the whole valley. If fellow Taoists have any ideas, you can bring them up and give it a try." On the five-colored five elements platform, the two cultivators Lu and Wang already showed they were proficient in formations. In fact, Mo Tiange came from a learned family and had access to ancient books in the virtual sky world, so her knowledge about formations was naturally richer than theirs. It was just that she deliberately hid her skills and didn't want to talk about it. The two cultivators Lu and Wang were startled by what she said. Soon after, they went to the side and started to discuss. Mo Tiange listened to their discussion. These two cultivators' attainments in formations weren't bad, but this illusory formation was too real. Their methods might be useless. She then sat on the side in silence and pondered by herself. All formations needed the support of external spiritual aura. The formation on the altar in the real valley was easily broken by her, because it had been too long, and its spiritual aura had declined. This illusory formation could create second-rank demonic beasts, foundation-building cultivators, and thousand-year-old spiritual plants brimming with spiritual aura. The amount of spiritual aura it used must have been enormous. That was strange. Why could this formation still display such power, even though it had existed for so long? The amount of spiritual aura it needed to trap them in this place and create those things brimming with spiritual aura was really frightening. It definitely couldn't be achieved by using hundreds or even thousands of spirit stones. The spirit stones used to create such an exquisite formation must have been of a high grade. Spirit stones were also divided into grades. Ordinary spirit stones whose grades weren't mentioned were all low-grade spirit stones. In addition, there were middle-grade spirit stones and high-grade spirit stones. Middle-grade and high-grade spirit stones were very rare in the cultivation world. Cultivators after the core formation realm usually couldn't obtain them. Because Mo Tiange was Lord Daoist Jinghe's disciple, she received some middle-grade and high-grade spirit stones as a disciple. But even if she had them, she usually only used low-grade spirit stones. Middle-grade and high-grade spirit stones were reserved for laying high-level formations. The higher the level of a formation, the higher the concentration of spiritual aura it needed. Once the concentration of spiritual aura reached a certain level, it couldn't be increased just by increasing the number of spirit stones. She had to use middle-grade and high-grade spirit stones. Since the spiritual aura this formation needed was so frightening, Mo Tiange roughly guessed the number of high-grade spirit stones needed was probably more than 1,000 or even 10,000. 10,000 high-grade spirit stones. Mo Tiange thought about it and felt it was terrifying. Because she was Lord Daoist Jinghe's advanced inner disciple, her disciples' rations were only a bit less than core formation cultivators. But it was several times more than ordinary foundation-building cultivators, and even elite disciples. However, she only received about 10 middle-grade and high-grade spirit stones every year. If she didn't advance, it would take her more than 1,000 years to save up 10,000 high-grade spirit stones. She was in charge of all the affairs in Shangqing Palace. Lord Daoist Jinghe only received about 100 high-grade spirit stones every year. Even so, it would take him several decades, or even 100 years, to save up 10,000 high-grade spirit stones. If the consumption of cultivating, laying formations, and so on were taken into account, her cheap master's net worth was probably only this much, right? What was the identity of the master of this place? Her master was a nascent soul cultivator from one of the top cultivation groups in the celestial pole. Even among nascent soul cultivators, his net worth was considered rich, but he probably wouldn't use 10,000 high-grade spirit stones to lay a formation. Could it be a cultivator in the nascent soul realm or above? This thought only flashed in Emotinga's mind, but she soon shook her head. She had seen Zhong Muling and Yuan Bao. Judging from the illusory sky formation, this formation was a lot worse, and didn't seem to be the work of a deification cultivator. Besides, how could a deification cultivator be so easy to find? According to Yuan Bao, the world was so big, and the celestial pole was only a corner. There were more than 10 places like the celestial pole, and it would take several thousand years for a deification cultivator to appear. How could she be so lucky as to casually enter a deification cultivator's immortal's cave? She shook her head and continued to think about how to crack the formation. Spiritual aura. Right. Such a huge illusory formation definitely couldn't exist for a long time. Even if she couldn't crack it, it would be good if it could last for several months. A happy expression appeared on her face, but a moment later her smile froze. Wrong. She only thought that an illusory formation would certainly consume a lot of spiritual aura, but she never thought that an illusory formation might make people feel wronged. One day might turn into a year. If that was the case, perhaps being trapped here for several months would turn into several hundred years, and they wouldn't be able to leave for several hundred years. However, they also couldn't really cultivate for several hundred years. In the end, they might go crazy, right? Thinking up to this point, Emotinga still couldn't find an answer, so she sighed. Taoist Fangjing noticed her expression, so he walked towards her and asked, "Fellow Taoist, what's wrong?" Emotinga shook her head. "It's nothing. I just can't think of a way to crack it." She turned around and saw that the two cultivators Lu and Wang were also shaking their heads and sighing. Obviously, they also couldn't think of a way to crack it. As for the two Bishuan court female disciples, upon seeing their cautious expressions, they finally realized what kind of dangerous situation they were in, so they were no longer in the mood to quarrel. Instead, they just huddled together with fear on their faces. The 6 of them were at their wits' end. They sat on the stone statue's altar for a whole day and watched the sky turn dark, but they still couldn't come up with a solution. There was also no trace of the Yao couple and Yin Ruoshu. Seeing that the sky was already dark, Emotinga casually found a place on the altar to sit and meditate. She didn't know whether this place was safe or not, so she naturally didn't dare to cultivate. She just adjusted her breath. Her surroundings were completely silent, but all of a sudden, she heard a whimper. Emotinga opened her eyes, then turned to look at the two women, Yin and Lu. The one who was crying was Yin Hanyan. She was sitting with tears in her eyes, hugging her knees, looking like she wanted to cry but didn't dare to. "Miss Yin." The cultivator surnamed Lu walked to the front of the two women, then asked softly, "What's wrong?" Yin Hanyan raised her head. Her eyes were brimming with tears, looking delicate and lovely. She said in a trembling voice, I. She wanted to say something but didn't dare to. The cultivator surnamed Wang also walked over. Upon seeing her like this, the two male cultivators both looked comforted. The cultivator surnamed Lu seized the initiative and comforted her. "Miss Yin, don't worry. I'm here. I'll protect you." Upon hearing what he said, Yin Hanyan blinked, and a tear fell from her eye. "Really?" The two male cultivators nodded desperately. Emotinga originally thought that senior marshal sister Lu would laugh at her, but unexpectedly she didn't. She glanced at her, only to find that senior marshal sister Lu was sitting in a daze. Her eyes were unfocused, and she looked like she had lost her soul. From time to time, she would smile sweetly, but in the end, her expression would be infinitely sad. Emotinga remembered that senior marshal sister Lu and Yin Hanyan were fighting over a man's favor during the day. Apparently, she was thinking about her big brother Tang. However, judging from her expression and the conversation they had during the day, she was probably thinking about sad things. Seeing Yin Hanyan talking to the two cultivators like a little white rabbit, then comparing it to the desolate expression on senior marshal sister Lu's face, Emotinga couldn't help but sympathize with her. No matter who was right or wrong between them, right now, it was very obvious who had more true feelings for her. Yin Hanyan was probably used to winning men's favor like this, but this female cultivator surnamed Lu was now only thinking about her big brother Tang. In fact, it wasn't strange that Big Brother Tang liked Yin Hanyin more. Both men and women thought the other party was very strange. Women liked by men were usually not recognized by the same sex. And men liked by women were usually considered by men to be embroidered pillows. No matter whether Yin Hanyin pretended to be weak or pitiful, men always fell for this trick. But that person shouldn't be like this, right? In his eyes, men and women seemed to be the same. Aside from cultivating, he had nothing else to do. After thinking for a long time, Daoist Fangjing suddenly shouted in the darkness, "Who's there?" Mo Tiange was startled. She immediately stood up and prepared to fight. She spread her divine sense, but in the next second she was stunned. In the darkness, a tall man slowly walked towards her. He wore a high hat and a broad belt, looked heroic, and his whole body emitted a frightening momentum. The other people's expressions changed greatly. This momentum. He was a core formation senior. After seeing this person clearly, Daoist Fangjing looked at Mo Zhe's reaction out of habit. However, he saw Mo Tiange staring at that person, seemingly thinking about something. He didn't have time to think too much. He cupped his hands and tried to speak as calmly and respectfully as possible. "Senior, I'm Junior Fangjing. May I ask how Senior got here?" That person didn't pay him any attention and walked straight towards Mo Tiange. Fangjing and the others were horrified. Although they outnumbered him, the other party was a core formation cultivator. The gap between a core formation cultivator and a foundation building cultivator was too big. They didn't know where this person came from. If he harbored evil intentions towards them, he only needed to wave his hand, and they would probably, under their fearful and trembling gazes, that person finally stopped several feet away from them. Mo Tiange also heaved a sigh of relief. She glanced at him and said, "This is an illusion." "An illusion?" Fangjing and the others were startled, but they still looked at him cautiously. They were afraid this illusion would have the same attack power as the one they encountered. "Tiange." The illusion spoke all of a sudden. Fangjing and the others were startled once again. Cultivators Liu and Wang didn't need to say anything since they'd never seen a person's illusion. Although Fangjing and the two disciples Yin and Liu had seen the illusion of Big Brother Tang, that illusion couldn't speak. The illusion walked towards Mo Tiange step by step and said softly, "Tiange, why didn't you say goodbye to me when you left?" Mo Tiange closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she found the illusion was still there. She could only smile bitterly. "Why should I say goodbye to you?" The illusion paused for a moment then said, "You shouldn't have come to say goodbye. I didn't want to see you." Although Mo Tiange knew the illusion in front of her was fake, she still felt her heart tighten. After a long time, she finally exhaled and said softly, "Yes. I don't know the reason, but you've already used your actions to explain that you don't want to see me. I also don't want to see you again. Don't appear in front of me again." As she spoke, she closed her eyes and turned her head. Upon hearing what she said, the illusion stood there for a while then suddenly walked forward until he was very close to her. Mo Tiange heard his voice suddenly soften. "In fact, I wanted to see you. I just. His hand was about to wrap around her, but Mo Tiange took a step back. She said those words because she hoped the illusion would disappear on its own. But she couldn't control her thoughts. She took a deep breath, raised her head, and stared at the illusion that was almost no different from the real person in front of her. She said word by word, "You're fake. I don't want to fake." The illusion smiled. It was a smile that rarely appeared on the real person. "I'm real. You want me to be real." Mo Tiange realized her state of mind was very chaotic. She knew this illusion wouldn't disappear, but she almost couldn't control herself. "Fellow Taoist Yi." At this time, Fangjing shouted and threw a talisman at her. "This is a heart-calming talisman." Mo Tiange took it and stuck it on her body without hesitation. Although her state of mind couldn't calm down immediately, it was no longer chaotic. She slowly calmed her breathing, but she was seriously looking at the illusion in front of her. "I admit that I have feelings for you, but I want to walk the path of immortal ascension. If you love me, I'll be happy. If you hate me, I won't be sad." The man in the light blue Taoist robe finally faded away as she spoke. When the illusion completely disappeared, Fang Zeng and the others finally heaved sighs of relief. A core formation cultivator. The illusion here had the power of a real person. If they really fought with this illusion, they wouldn't even need to think of a way to get out, because they would die here. Fellow Taoist Yi. At that moment, Taoist Fang Zeng looked at Mo Tiange with a different gaze. Just now, he heard the illusion call her by another name, so he knew the name Yi Xiaotian was most likely fake. But it didn't matter. They were just strangers who met by chance. Maybe they wouldn't see each other again after they parted. So what did it matter what name she was called? The most important thing was that the illusion just now was a core formation cultivator. This woman had an unusual relationship with a core formation cultivator, which meant her identity was more complicated than he imagined. In that case, he definitely couldn't offend her. In addition, Fang Zeng noticed something else. He had been in the cultivation world for several hundred years and met countless cultivators. So he recognized at a glance that the illusion was wearing the Taoist robe of Xianqing School, the number 2 cultivation group in the celestial pole. Apparently, this woman was also related to Xianqing School. In a flash, relying on his rich experience, Taoist Fang Zeng analyzed all this and had a rough idea of what to do. Whether it was because of her hidden identity or the abilities she showed so far, he absolutely couldn't offend this woman. Mo Tiange wiped the sweat on her forehead, then smiled at Taoist Fang Zeng. Fellow Taoist Fang Zeng, thank you for the heart-calming talisman just now. The price of a heart-calming talisman is quite high. It's not cheap. I don't want fellow Taoists to lose it for no reason, so I might as well exchange this talisman with you. Taoist Fang Zeng took the talisman and looked at it. This was actually a foundation-building cultivator's invisibility talisman. He originally felt distressed about using a heart-calming talisman that cost more than 100 spirit stones. But now he realized he made a huge profit. A foundation-building cultivator's invisibility talisman was priceless. Even if it could be bought, it would cost at least several hundred spirit stones. Thank you, fellow Taoist. I won't be polite. Chapter 161. Mo Tiange had her own considerations as to why she immediately used an invisibility talisman. First of all, she was no longer the miserable little aura-refining cultivator she was before. She had a school and a master, so a mere invisibility talisman wasn't something she felt distressed about. Secondly, although pretending to be a pig to eat a tiger was an extremely effective move, there was no need for it if one was strong enough. There were a total of 5 groups of people here, so it would be very good if these 3 Bichuan court female disciples didn't drag them down. In terms of fighting strength, Mo Tiange didn't care at all. The 2 male cultivators, Lu and Wang, both had relatively high cultivation levels and weren't weak. If they joined forces, Mo Tiange would have a hard time dealing with them. However, the 2 of them weren't united. The Yao couple had great teamwork, but their cultivations were a little low. Taoist Fang Zeng's cultivation level was relatively high, and he was also strong in fights of magical powers. However, he didn't have many treasures, so Mo Tiange believed it wouldn't be difficult for her to deal with him if she went all out. That being the case, she might as well show her strength. Others might not know, but Taoist Fang Zeng was a smart man. Not only would he revere her, but he would also sincerely regard her as his companion. In this illusory array, if there was no one to warn him, he would easily fall into the trap. Having an ally was better than being alone. After giving Taoist Fang Zeng an invisibility talisman, she casually chatted with him for a while, then found a corner and sat cross-legged to meditate. Because of that illusion just now, the 2 cultivators Lu and Wang couldn't be bothered to curry favor with Yin Hanyin anymore. Instead, they hid to the side and whispered to each other, seemingly discussing Mo Tiange's real identity. She didn't care what these people thought of her. After they left this valley, they would go their separate ways. Who would know who was who? Just like that, the night passed without any danger. There were several kinds of illusions in the middle. Fortunately, they reminded each other, so nothing serious happened. The sky was bright and birds were chirping. The first ray of morning sunlight finally shone into the valley. The valley was surrounded by steep cliffs, and the sun shone in at 9 o'clock. The 6 people present were all foundation-building cultivators, so they didn't need to deliberately rest. It was just that after a night of fright, Yin and Lu were not in good spirits. Mo Tiange and Daoist Fangjing glanced at each other. They both saw helplessness in each other's eyes. These female cultivators were really unable to accomplish anything, but were good at spoiling things. He wanted to leave them behind, but he was afraid that it would affect him. Even after the sky brightened, there were still no signs of activity. The 2 people, Wang and Lu, couldn't sit still anymore. After whispering to each other for a while, they walked towards Mo Tiange and Daoist Fangjing together. It hadn't even been a day since they were trapped inside the formation, but they already formed a small group. Yun, Lu, and Wang were from the same cultivation group, so even if they had any conflicts, they were still together. Mo Tiange and Daoist Fangjing were both single people, and their habits were also quite similar, so they were naturally closer to each other. Fellow Taoists. The one speaking was the cultivator surnamed Lu. Mo Tiange and Daoist Fangjing opened their eyes and stared at them. Lu and Wang also sat down cross-legged in front of them and said, "Fellow Taoists, we can't go on like this. High-level illusory formations usually consume the energy of those who enter the formation. The longer we stay here, the more disadvantageous it will be for us. Who knows, one day, we might run out of blood essence." Daoist Fangjing was taken aback. "Consume blood essence?" The cultivator surnamed Wang answered, "Correct. We 2 martial brothers are disciples of Giga School. Our Giga School originated from Tianliang School. Now that Tianliang School has long been exterminated, our Giga School is definitely the strongest in the field of formations." It was only now that these 2 cultivators revealed their sex inheritance. Mo Tiange had indeed heard of Giga School. Although what the cultivator surnamed Wang said was a bit exaggerated, it wasn't far from the truth. There weren't any big cultivation groups in the celestial pole that were proficient in formations. There were only several medium-sized cultivation groups that were proficient in formations, and Giga School could be considered one of the best among them. However, the corners of Mo Tiange's mouth curved into a faint smile. What the 2 people said was a bit too shocking. She had studied illusory formations before, and there was indeed a saying about consuming blood essence, but that only happened when one was bewitched. Inside an illusory formation, if one was bewitched by the illusion, their blood essence would be absorbed by the formation. However, if one's mind was firm, they wouldn't be affected too much. Upon seeing her expression, the 2 people surnamed Lu and Wang felt a bit restless. They didn't know what she meant, so they glanced at each other. The cultivator surnamed Lu then said with a smile, "Little brother is Lu Xiangxin, and this is my junior martial brother, Wang Xiangji. May I know how to address you too?" She didn't know whether Daoist Fangjing had greeted them or not, but the mechanism was activated the moment Mo Tiange entered the hall of the 5-colored 5 elements platform. She only heard their surnames from Shang Ruan. "My Daoist name is Fangjing." Daoist Fangjing nodded at the 2 people. Mo Tiange then said, "Yi Xiaotian." The 2 people surnamed Lu and Wang were only surprised for a moment, but they didn't care too much about why her name sounded different from last night. The 4 of them greeted each other again. Lu Xiangxin then said, "Fellow Taoists, in short, if we stay in this illusory formation for another day, we'll suffer some injuries. It'd be better for us to leave as soon as possible." Mo Tiange chuckled. "We've always wanted to leave, but we just couldn't find the direction." Since fellow Taoists said this, could it be that you found a way? This. Lu Xiangxin hesitated for a moment. Wang Xiangji took over the conversation. "Miss Yi, to be honest, this formation is indeed brilliant. We 2 martial brothers also can't figure it out, but we can't just sit and do nothing, can we?" Daoist Fangjing glanced at Mo Tiange's expression then asked, "Then what should we do in your opinion?" Upon hearing Daoist Fangjing's tone of relief, Lu Xiangxin's spirits were lifted. According to our research on formations, no matter how brilliant a formation is, it's impossible for it to be flawless. This valley isn't big, but it's very complicated. If we look around a bit, we'll definitely be able to find it. "You're right. Mo Tiange cast a glance at the two people surnamed Yin and Lu. There are 6 of us. Should we split up and look? The two people surnamed Lu and Wang noticed her meaningful glance. They were both smart people, so how could they not understand what she meant? They immediately became somewhat hesitant. Mo Tiange put on a fake smile. Fellow Taoists, we can't just eat and not work. Lu Xiangxin was fine, but Wang Xiangji's face instantly flushed upon hearing what she said. Mo Tiange glanced at the two people surnamed Yin and Lu, meaning to ask whether they would be responsible for these two people. The two people surnamed Lu and Wang hesitated. After all, although they were trying to please them, their lives were still a bit more important. Mo Tiange mocked them for wanting to take advantage of them, but not wanting to take responsibility. Wang Xiangji was thin-skinned. Seeing as Mo Tiange was also a beautiful woman, mocking him to his face inevitably made him lose face. For a moment, the situation became awkward. Only the two people surnamed Yin and Lu were far away, so they didn't notice anything. Ahem. Taoist Fangjing coughed then said, Fellow Taoists, I'll tell you the truth. I'm already being polite by not taking their lives. I don't want to work for other people. Taoist Fangjing was an individual cultivator. The world of individual cultivators was much crueler than that of cultivation group disciples. Generally speaking, people who didn't show enough strength wouldn't be accepted if they went on an adventure together. Right now, he was already being polite by not making things difficult for these two Bichuan court female cultivators. After all, this matter wasn't the same as agreeing to go on an adventure. The 9 of them were inadvertently tied together. Since Taoist Fangjing already said this much, the two people surnamed Lu and Wang had nothing else to say. They glanced at each other, then Lu Xiangxin said, All right, the 4 of us will continue to search. As for the others, we won't care about them. Of course, we'll occupy the 5 elements platform separately, so it'd be best for us to take our lives into consideration. What he said gained the approval of the other 3 people. After a brief discussion, Lu Xiangxin told the two people surnamed Yin and Lu. Mo Tiange wasn't interested in what they had to say. She only saw from afar that Yin Hanyin lowered her head and wiped her tears as soon as she heard what Lu Xiangxin said. It was only after Lu Xiangxin comforted her that he returned with a bitter smile. Mo Tiange didn't feel like caring about other people's business, and Taoist Fangjing naturally didn't care about this kind of youngster's pestering. The 4 of them were silent the whole way. They came down from the altar and slowly searched. Not too far from the altar, Wang Xiangji suddenly called out. Although the 4 of them were together, they were searching separately. At that moment, the other 3 people all raised their heads and looked at him. Wang Xiangji's expression was heavy as he beckoned them over. The 3 of them flew towards him. Once they arrived at Wang Xiangji's location, Mo Tiange's expression immediately darkened. It was Yin Ruoshu. Yin Ruoshu was currently lying on a 5 elements platform. Her complexion was deathly pale, and she wasn't breathing at all. Mo Tiange crouched down and tried to inject her spiritual aura into Yin Ruoshu's body, but it was to no avail. She stood up and shook her head. There's no saving her. They were trapped inside this illusory formation. Although they couldn't leave, they weren't in any danger. Now that someone died, the 4 of them had grave expressions on their faces. Although this formation was an illusory formation, it could still kill people. Among the 4 of them, Mo Tiange was the only woman, so she was naturally in charge of examining the corpse. There weren't any injuries on Yin Ruoshu's body. Her clothes were intact, and there were no signs of a struggle. It was as if she suddenly died here. Mo Tiange examined her carefully. In the end, she discovered that Yin Ruoshu's posture was a bit strange. Her hand was stretched to one side, as if she wanted to grab something. How is it? Wang Xiangji asked anxiously. Mo Tiange didn't answer. She once again used her spiritual aura to strike the top of Yin Ruoshu's head. After a person died, their meridians became rigid and spiritual aura couldn't be injected into them. However, the top of the head was a shortcut to the dantian, so spiritual aura could still be injected into it. Several breaths later, Mo Tiange let go of her hand and stood up with a grave expression. Fellow Taoisti, how is it? Daoist Fangjing also asked with concern. Mo Tinga sighed and said, all of her blood essence was exhausted. Apparently, she was blinded by the illusion and couldn't struggle free in the end. Judging from Yin Ruoshu's posture, she was obviously trying to grab something, but there was nothing in front of her. That thing should be her illusion. Once she died, the illusion naturally disappeared. The other three people were once again silent. Lu Xiangxin and Wang Xiangji glanced at each other. Both of them saw a hint of astonishment in each other's eyes. They previously said they would die from exhaustion of their blood essence, just to scare these two people. They never expected that such a thing would actually happen. How could they not panic? Mo Tinga muttered to herself for a while, then said, fellow Taoist, it seems fellow Taoist Yan's death happened last night, but we didn't feel anything at all. Daoist Fangjing was dumbfounded. Fellow Taoist, are you saying our lives won't be affected by other people? That's not necessarily the case. Mo Tinga took out an empty Qingquan bag, then waved her hand to put Yin Ruoshu's corpse away. After all, the three of them were on the same stone platform. Maybe it's enough as long as one of them is alive. Seeing her putting Yin Ruoshu's corpse away made the other three people rather envious. Of course, it wasn't because they had strange hobbies. They were just envious of the things on Yin Ruoshu's body. However, they also didn't dare to offend Mo Tinga because of this. She didn't directly take the Qingquan bag. She put the corpse away instead, most likely to give it to the other two female cultivators. However, this already proves that if we're confused by the illusion, it's indeed possible that we'll die from exhaustion of our blood essence. The three people once again fell into silence. All right, let's not waste time here. Let's keep looking. Daoist Fangjing nodded. We should be more careful. Let's search in pairs. Although they didn't split up, they searched separately. Now they didn't dare to split up anymore. They formed a team of two and slowly searched along the way. The atmosphere was depressing. Perhaps it was lucky or unlucky, but right after they searched that intersection, they suddenly heard a cry of alarm. The four of them looked at each other to make sure it wasn't an illusion, then they flew towards the source of the sound. They didn't fly far before Mo Tinga's sharp eyes saw Shang Ruwan's figure on a 5 elements platform. She was delighted, but she was immediately alarmed. That was indeed Shang Ruwan, but there was another person not far from her. Ah! Wang Xiangji cried out in surprise. He said in astonishment, That's fellow Taoist Yao, but why? Mo Tinga also frowned deeply. Judging from his figure, that was indeed Yao Zixio. But the strange thing was, his cultivation level was actually in the core formation realm. How was that possible? She couldn't rule out the possibility that there were some fated chances inside this illusory formation, but there was no way it could allow a cultivator to directly jump from the early stage of the foundation building realm to the core formation realm. Foundation building cultivators' dantians and meridians could only hold so much spiritual aura. But the spiritual aura of a core formation realm cultivator would increase by 1,000 times, and their dantians and meridians would need to be reshaped. Even if they had enough spiritual aura to allow a cultivator to directly jump from the early stage of the foundation building realm to the core formation realm, it would still take them 1 to 3 years to remold their bodies. Could it be an illusion? But judging from Shang Ruwan's expression, it didn't seem like it. The other three people were hesitant about whether they should approach her or not. After all, the spiritual aura pressure of a core formation cultivator was real, and they didn't dare to clash with a core formation cultivator. At that moment, Mo Tinga was already flying towards Shang Ruwan. Fellow Taoist Yi, Daoist Fangjing called out but didn't stop her. He helplessly continued to hesitate. When he turned around, he saw that Lu Xiangxin and Wang Xiangji both had restless expressions on their faces. Daoist Fangjing knew the situation wasn't good, so he hastily said, Fellow Taoists, do you really believe there's a way to allow someone to directly jump from the early stage of the foundation building realm to the core formation realm? Lu Xiangxin and Wang Xiangji glanced at each other, then smiled perfunctorily. How could we? We're just curious. Aren't you curious? Daoist Fangjing's gaze wavered. How could he not be curious? As an individual cultivator, How much effort did it take for him to cultivate to the middle stage of the foundation building realm? He didn't have much time left in his lifespan, so he was eager to find fated chances to advance to the late stage and advance to the core formation realm. However, fellow Taoists, you better calm down. I'm curious, but how could there be such a shortcut in this world? Yesterday we were almost deceived by that white jade snow lotus. Do you two still remember? What he said stunned the two of them, but they soon calmed down a bit. Taoist Fangjing said, "There's no harm in watching. If there's anything wrong, it won't be too late to leave." On the other side, Mo Tinga flew to Shang Ruwan's side, then called out softly, "Big sister Shang, are you all right?" Shang Ruwan was so distracted that she actually didn't notice someone was coming. Now that she saw Mo Tinga, she immediately grabbed Mo Tinga's hand and said with a panicked expression, "Little sister Yi, big sister, don't panic." Seeing that Shang Ruwan couldn't even speak properly, Mo Tinga hastily comforted her. "Tell me what happened first. Was that your husband?" Shang Ruwan nodded absent-mindedly. After taking a deep breath, she was finally able to speak smoothly. "Yes, that was Big Brother Xiao. What happened to you in the end? We looked for you for a whole day yesterday, but we couldn't find you. Why did fellow Taoist Yao suddenly advance to the core formation realm?" Shang Ruwan was sitting on the stone platform. Her forehead and cheeks were covered in sweat, but what Mo Tinga said astonished her. "Yesterday? Little sister Yi, when did we arrive here?" Mo Tinga wrinkled her brows slightly. Yesterday, Shang Ruwan muttered to herself. Gradually, fear appeared on her face. "No, Big Brother Xiao and we've been living here for 3 years. Mo Tinga was also terrified when she heard what he said. 3 years. The 6 of them had indeed only spent one night together. But why did Shang Ruwan feel like 3 years had passed? "Big sister Shang, calm down. Tell me slowly, what happened to you?" Under Mo Tinga's reassurance, Shang Ruwan finally calmed down a bit. She said slowly, "After the 5 elements platforms were activated, Big Brother Xiao and I came here. We discovered that this place was full of spiritual aura and was very suitable for cultivation. It was also as beautiful as a fairyland, and there was no one to disturb us. Although we couldn't go out, this place was no different from a paradise, so I suggested we stay here. At first, I felt very happy. There was no one to disturb us, we didn't need to wander around, and we didn't need to hide from other people. But Big Brother Xiao became more and more irritable. He said he'd reached a bottleneck in his cultivation. Although this place was full of spiritual aura, it wasn't helpful to his cultivation. He said he wanted to enter closed-door meditation because he wanted to become stronger. We had an argument. In a fit of anger, I ran out. But when I came back I saw." Shang Ruwan grabbed Mo Tinga's sleeve. Her tears started to fall. "Little sister Yi, Big Brother Xiao must have been possessed by the devil. No, this really isn't right. Look at him." Mo Tinga raised her head and stared at Yao Zixio, who wasn't too far from her. Yao Zixio seemed to be cultivating some kind of secret technique. He was flying in midair, and his whole body was wrapped in a black substance. Sounds of wind and thunder could be faintly heard inside. 1 day, 3 years. Mo Tinga could roughly guess what happened. This life is eternal. She finally guessed a little about the meaning of the words. This life is eternal. This life is eternal, and eternity is only 1 day. This was the most frightening aspect of this illusory formation. Shang Ruwan always fantasized about peaceful days. This place was like a fairyland, which triggered this thought in her. Therefore, in the beginning, they were living in Shang Ruwan's fantasy. The two of them lived without anyone to disturb them, which was why they couldn't find each other. However, although it was only 3 years, the actual time wasn't like that, which was why he didn't make any progress in his cultivation. Shang Ruwan didn't care about it, but Yao Zixio was unwilling, which led to this unforeseen event. But what was going on with Yao Zixio? Mo Tinga couldn't figure this out. She herself obtained a great fated chance, whether it was the deification great ancestor or the virtual sky world. But she didn't believe there was any fated chance in this world that could allow someone to advance from the early stage of the foundation building realm to the core formation realm overnight. Big Sister Shang. After a long time, Emotinga said slowly, I don't think your husband has been possessed by the devil. Chapter 162. Shang Ruan stared at Emotinga in a daze. She didn't understand what she meant. Emotinga stared at Yao Zixio, who was flying in the air, and said slowly, This life is eternal. This life is eternal. Eternal is only one day. In this place, aside from leaving, any wish can be granted. If you want a paradise, I'll give you a paradise. If he wants to hold his head high, I'll give him that. She looked down at Shang Ruan with pity and sadness. So it's all fake. Your 3 years were fake, and his core formation was also fake. Shang Ruan was shocked. She didn't come back to her senses for a long time. Emotinga continued to say, This illusory formation will show the things everyone wants the most. Big sister, what you want the most is an undisturbed life for the two of you. And what he wants the most. Emotinga didn't continue. Shang Ruan already understood what she meant. Shang Ruan was stunned for a long time before she asked slowly, Then what's the result? Upon seeing Shang Ruan's expression, Emotinga almost didn't have the heart to say it, but she had to. That fellow Taoist Yin has already fallen. We're sure she was bewitched. She was blinded by the illusion and died because her blood essence was exhausted. Shang Ruan was shocked. She stared blankly at her husband, who was entangled in the black fog in the air. She didn't say anything for a long time. Death. What he wanted the most. *****. She remembered the first time she met her father's new disciple 90 years ago. You're called Yao Zixio? Do you know who I am? Although that young boy had arrogance in his eyes, he didn't treat her like a child. Instead, he bowed cautiously. Greetings to Senior Martial Sister. She smiled proudly and pretended to cough twice. Nodding, she said, Yes, you're very polite. Eldest Martial Brother teased her. Little Junior Martial Brother, you're a bit older than Little Junior Martial Sister. You can just call her Junior Martial Sister. The young boy looked at her and said earnestly, I entered the sect later than Senior Martial Sister, so I should call her Senior Martial Sister. She was so happy that she shouted at Eldest Martial Brother, Yes, Senior Martial Sister. She turned around and patted her small chest. Little Junior Martial Brother, I'll protect you from now on. She remembered 70 years ago when she just built her foundation. What's so good about that kid? Listen to me obediently, and marry your big brother and I. She knelt in front of her father motionless, but she held her head high, unwilling to yield. Rebellious daughter. Her father flew into a rage and slammed his palm down on her. Her father, who was at the peak of foundation building, showed almost no mercy in this palm. She spat out a mouthful of blood, and her meridians were heavily injured. But she still clenched her teeth and refused to let go. Her mother wept at the side. Wanner, just listen to your father. Obedient. No, she struggled to get up and used all her strength to kneel in front of her father. She said word by word, Father, if you force me, I will die. No one had ever dared to disobey her father like this, not even herself. But at this moment, she had no regrets. She remembered 60 years ago, when he finally reached the Zhuji phase. Father, Junior Martial Brother has built his foundation. She happily ran into the hall. There was no joy on her father's face. Instead, he coldly said, If you hadn't secretly given him the foundation building pills you hid, how could he have built his foundation? She was stunned. She didn't understand why her father, who had already tacitly accepted this matter, would be so cold. Father, didn't you personally accept Junior Martial Brother as your disciple? Why do you treat him? If it wasn't because his family once had a core formation cultivator, and definitely had treasures, why would I accept him with his aptitude? She never expected her father to say such a thing. Father, she shouted in disbelief. You're using Junior Martial Brother? What do you mean by using or not using? Her father's expression was indifferent. If I hadn't accepted him as my disciple, how could he have lived these several decades of good days? How could he have built his foundation? Wanner, your big brother and I still misses you. He built his foundation long ago. With his aptitude, It won't be a problem for him to advance to the middle stage of the core formation realm in a dozen or so years. You should calm down. Father, why didn't you promise me that you wouldn't force me to marry Big Brother and I? Today is different from the past. You can't be willful anymore. Her father's expression was 30% indifferent and 70% complacent. The betrothal gift your uncle and I gave me was a dustless pill. I've been begging for this pill for many years. With this dustless pill, maybe you can enter the core formation realm in one go. Father's great way of core formation is in your hands. She remembered that night. Junior Marshall brother, let's go. Let's go. She grabbed his hand and said while shedding tears. The little boy from back then was now a gentle and steady young man. He held her hand and said in astonishment, Senior Marshall sister, what's wrong? She said while crying. If we don't go now, it'll be too late. Father still wants me to marry Big Brother and I family already said that even if I die, they'll carry me into their family. He turned pale with fright and was stunned on the spot. Junior Marshall brother, if we don't go now, it'll be too late. My mother's heart softened, so she let me out. I'll only have one night. Tomorrow. His expression was gloomy. After a long time, he finally clenched his teeth and said, All right, Senior Marshall sister, let's go. We'll go far away and never let them find us again. She remembered the day they got married. There were no guests, no wedding clothes. There were only the ice-cold moonlight and two lonely shadows. With heaven and earth as my witness and the bright moon as my matchmaker, I, Shang Ruwan, will marry Yao Zixio and never leave him in this lifetime. He also made a vow. With heaven and earth as my witness and the bright moon as my matchmaker, I, Yao Zixio, will marry Shang Ruwan and will live and die together in this lifetime. The ice-cold night wind blew. Not far from them, a pack of wolves howled under the moon. But she felt her whole heart was filled with happiness. Senior Marshall sister. Do you still want to call me Senior Marshall sister now? He was stunned for a moment before he smiled. You're younger than me, so I'll call you Little Sister Wan from now on. What do you think? She also smiled and called out softly, Big Brother Xiao. It had been 60 years. Although she didn't have a fixed abode, and her cultivation level didn't advance, she had always been very satisfied. Her heart was very big. No one could make her feel happy except for him. Her heart was also very small. As long as she was with him, she would feel happy. Her tears fell. This was the first time she realized that happiness was so far away from her. Be careful. Mo Tinga grabbed Shang Ruwan and retreated hastily. The mass of black fog floating in the air suddenly exploded. Yao Zixio opened his eyes, and his momentum soared. The core formation realm. No matter what the reason was, the Yao Zixio in front of her was undoubtedly in the core formation realm. Inside this illusory formation, the illusions created wouldn't disappear unless one's willpower shifted. Otherwise, the illusions were no different from real people. Mo Tiange turned around to look. Fang Jing, Lu Xiangxin, and Wang Xiangji also had astonished expressions. Once he regained his senses, Fang Jing signaled them with his eyes and shouted in a low voice. Go! The four of them, along with Shang Ruwan, who was being pulled by Mo Tiange, fled into the distance. But in the next second, a majestic momentum soared from behind them. Two blood-curdling screams rang out. Lu and Wang, who were lagging behind, were sent flying. One crashed into a tree trunk, while the other fell on a 5 elements platform. Both of them vomited blood. It was unclear whether they were still alive or not. Stop! Yao Zixio shouted loudly. Mo Tiange quickly turned around. Daoist Fang Jing, who wasn't too far behind her, also stopped and turned around. At that moment, Yao Zixio's eyes were bloodshot and burning with raging flames. His robe fluttered even though there was no wind, and the momentum of a core formation cultivator assaulted their senses. Yao Zixio slowly swept his gaze over them. His gaze was cold and arrogant, as if he was looking at several ants. In the end, when his gaze fell on Shang Ruwan, his cold aura finally relaxed a bit. He said, Little Sister Wan, we can go back now. I can take you back now. Ha 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 ha. In the end, he actually threw his head back and laughed heartily. His voice was incomparably arrogant. Shang Ruan slowly broke free from Emotinga's grip, then walked forward step by step. Big Sister Shang. Emotinga couldn't help but call out. She could see that although Yao Zixio's cultivation level wasn't possessed by the devil, his mental state was. Right now, he could still recognize Shang Ruan. But who knew if he'd still retain his rationality in the next moment? Shang Ruan's footsteps faltered. She turned around and smiled at Emotinga. For some reason, Emotinga felt that Shang Ruan's smile looked even more desperate than her crying. Shang Ruan said softly, "Little sister Yi, thank you for being so kind. This matter isn't related to you. In a moment, let's go." Emotinga was dumbfounded. She meant, Shang Ruan had already turned around and was flying towards Yao Zixio. Yao Zixio reached out and embraced her. He said complacently, "Little sister Wan, are you happy?" Shang Ruan shook her head and said faintly, "I'm not happy." Yao Zixio wrinkled his brows, then asked anxiously, "Why? All these years, didn't you really want to go back? Now we can go back justifiably. Your father won't say anything anymore." "Is that so?" Shang Ruan's gaze was bone-chilling. "Big brother Xiao, is your current cultivation level real?" Yao Zixio was stunned for a moment before he became furious. "Little sister Wan, what do you mean? Of course my cultivation level is real. Take a look." He pulled Shang Ruan's hand, eager to prove himself. "This is the cultivation technique I obtained just now. As it turns out, there really are fated chances here. The master of this place was a cultivator with great divine power. After he passed away, he sealed his cultivation technique here, and I happened to obtain it." Shang Ruan looked at his complacent appearance indifferently. There was only deep sorrow in her heart. 100 years. 100 years. She finally saw this person clearly. This person she loved the most. As it turned out, in his heart, cultivation had always been the most important thing. As it turned out, this was the result he'd always wanted. She took the jade slip from Yao Zixio's hand and injected her divine sense into it. Soon after, she sneered and threw it back to him. "Big brother Xiao, take a look yourself. See what this is." Yao Zixio received the jade slip with doubt, but his expression changed greatly. Emotinga didn't know what happened, but she could make a rough guess. This so-called fated chance was just Yao Zixio's imagination. This jade slip naturally didn't contain any cultivation technique. It was either empty or completely useless. With one look, Yao Zixio naturally knew something was wrong. "No, it's real. It's real." At first he was mumbling to himself, but in the end, Yao Zixio's expression turned ruthless. He turned around and glared furiously at Emotinga and Fangzheng. "Did you steal it? Did you? Big brother Xiao." Shang Ruan shouted and grabbed his sleeve. "It has nothing to do with other people. This is an illusory formation, so you're hallucinating." "Illusory formation? Hallucination? No, you're lying to me. You're lying to me." Yao Zixio's momentum gushed out. With a wave of his arm, Shang Ruan cried out in alarm and fell from midair. Under Yao Zixio's gaze, Emotinga didn't dare to move. She could only watch helplessly as Shang Ruan fell. No matter how weak Yao Zixio was before, inside this illusory formation, he was a genuine core formation cultivator. No matter how arrogant Emotinga was, she didn't think she could fight against a core formation cultivator. If she fought, she couldn't win. If she ran, the valley was only this big, so she couldn't escape. Enter the virtual sky world? To enter the virtual sky world, she had to use the incantation, which would take at least 3 breaths of time. However, Yao Zixio was staring at them. If she made even the slightest movement, he might kill them. She didn't have a single breath of time. "Big brother Xiao." Shang Ruan was obviously injured, but she still struggled to get up. "Big brother Xiao, don't. You'll be possessed by the devil. Little sister Wan, you don't need to say anything. Do you think I don't know?" Yao Zixio's eyes were bloodshot, making him look even more demonic. "Back then, your father accepted me as his disciple because he fancied my Yao clan's treasures. To make him agree to let you marry me, I offered my Yao clan's ancestors' secret technique. But what did your father do? 10 years later, he still wanted you to marry someone else. Moreover, this time, I was already useless, And he even wanted to kill me. What? Shang Ruan was shocked. My father, You don't know, right? Yao Zixio grinned. His calm and refined demeanor could no longer be seen. His ruthless appearance was even more frightening. Back then, it wasn't because he loved you, his daughter, but because I offered Yao clan's treasures to him. But even so, he only let us off for 10 years. When you came to look for me that day, I already received news that he wanted to kill me. I originally planned to leave by myself, but you came looking for me. I couldn't bear to part with you. Shang Ruan's lips trembled, but she couldn't say anything. It was actually like this. No wonder he was so eager to cultivate. No wonder he probably wanted to take revenge after he formed his gold core. She suddenly burst into tears. As it turned out, there was no solution. There was no solution at all. She thought she only needed to persuade him, but it turned out he actually had this kind of reason. Even if he was willing to walk out of the illusory formation, he was still thinking about taking revenge. Little Sister Wan, Yao Zixio said softly, don't worry. For your sake, I won't take his life. It'll be enough if I just cripple his cultivation level. All these years, I've been asking around, but your father didn't succeed in forming his gold core. Retribution, this is retribution. Ha 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 ha. Once he finished laughing, Yao Zixio shifted his gaze towards Emotienga and Taoist Fangjing. He said slowly, I'll start with the two of you. Come, let me see your skills. Both Emotienga's and Taoist Fangjing's expressions darkened. Each of them held their magic tools, or magic weapons tightly. Yao Zixio seemed like a cat teasing a mouse. He didn't attack right away, as if he was really waiting to see their skills. After a moment of silence, Emotienga said, Fellow Taoist Yao, you don't believe this is an illusory formation? I believe it. Yao Zixio said with his head held high. However, advancing to the core formation realm wasn't an illusion. If it was an illusion, I wouldn't have such a clear feeling. I've really become stronger. This feeling. While he was still reminiscing, Emotienga smiled. Yes, it's a feeling, but feelings can be wrong. You. Yao Zixio glared at her angrily after being denied again. He raised his hand, and a ball made of spiritual aura gradually appeared in his palm. Emotienga and Taoist Fangjing became even more nervous. Core formation cultivators could materialize their spiritual aura. So a strike from a spiritual energy ball like that definitely wasn't something foundation-building cultivators like them could withstand. Big Brother Xiao! Shang Ruan shouted. Big Brother Xiao, please let them go. If you want to take revenge, it has nothing to do with them. Shut up! Yao Zixio shouted. In the cultivation world, what's the big deal about killing people? You're just being soft-hearted. I'm afraid you'll be possessed by the devil. Possessed by the devil? So what if I'm possessed by the devil? Yao Zixio sneered. If I can obtain such formidable power, I'm willing to be possessed by the devil. Besides, what's the harm in being possessed by the devil? Master Song Feng is a great late-stage nascent soul cultivator. But didn't he also kill innocent people? I've never seen his cultivation level affected by being possessed by the devil. What inner devil? What moral integrity? They're all fake. Fake. Shang Ruan couldn't persuade him anymore. She stared blankly at the overbearing Yao Zixio with tears rolling down her cheeks. She said mournfully, What about me? What do you want to do with me? What should I do if you're possessed by the devil? Yao Zixio was silent. His expression softened as if her words touched the softest part of his heart. At that moment, Emotienga gave Taoist Fangjing a meaningful glance. The two of them understood each other tacitly, and started to make their own preparations. Big Brother Xiao, do you still remember the vow we made that day? I, Shang Ruan, will marry Yao Zixio, and I'll never leave him in this lifetime. Shang Ruan wiped the blood from the corners of her mouth, then flew up while swaying. She reached out to him. Big Brother Xiao, don't leave me. Yao Zixio couldn't help but also reach out to hold her hand. His voice also softened. I, Yao Zixio, will marry Shang Ruan, and we'll live and die together in this lifetime. A smile finally appeared on Shang Ruan's face as she leaned towards him. She watched as Yao Zixio couldn't help but pull her into his embrace. a magic tool suddenly appeared and ruthlessly pierced Yao Zixio's heart. Ah! It was Shang Ruan's miserable scream. That short sword-shaped magic tool appeared in Yao Zixio's heart. Yao Zixio held the hilt of the short sword. He exerted some force, and the sword was pulled out, creating a trail of blood. He swayed, but he still managed to stand firm. He stared at Shang Ruan, who fell on a 5 elements platform after he swung his arm. His anger soared and he shouted in pain, You actually want to kill me? Shang Ruan fell on the 5 elements platform. She couldn't move at all, but her gaze was smiling. Big brother Xiao will never leave you in this lifetime. That being the case, let's die together. With every word she said, she kept vomiting blood. By the time she finished speaking, she was already covered in blood. Emotinga couldn't bear to watch. She suddenly regretted telling Shang Ruan that death was the result of falling into her trap. Since Yao Zixio wasn't willing to come out of the illusion, he'd die in the end, so she live and die together. She never thought the love between lovers in the mortal world could be realized in the cultivation world. But now, little sister Wan. Yao Zixio was dumbfounded. He floated in the air in a daze. Blood kept flowing from his heart, but he didn't feel it at all. Core formation. He suddenly mumbled, I've formed my gold core, but little sister Wan. As if he suddenly realized what had happened, he rushed over, threw himself on Shang Ruan, pulled her up and shouted, Little sister Wan! Little sister Wan! Shang Ruan was still smiling, but she couldn't move anymore. Emotinga could see that she was almost certainly going to die. Little sister Wan, you. But Shang Ruan didn't say anything to him. She just quietly closed her eyes, and her breath gradually disappeared. Little sister Wan. Yao Zixio shouted. Blood and tears gushed out of his eyes. They saw Yao Zixio gradually losing his color. It was as if he was petrified bit by bit. Slowly, he turned into a skeleton wearing a robe. As for the skeleton, it was still tightly hugging Shang Ruan's corpse. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support. And don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.